Let's take a deep breath, relax, and slowly explore the story of chocolate. Somewhere deep in the Amazon rainforest, roughly 5,300 years ago, a person living along a river in what is now southeastern Ecuador cracked open a strange pod that had fallen from a tree. Inside, wrapped in sweet, tangy white pulp, were dozens of pale, slippery seeds. They probably ate the pulp first, sucking the sugary flesh and spitting the bitter seeds onto the forest floor. But at some point, someone decided to do something different with those seeds. They collected them, let them sit in a pile until they began to change, and then ground them into a paste. And in that quiet moment, without any idea of what they had set in motion, they began a story that would stretch across oceans, reshape empires, and give the world one of its most beloved flavors. We know this happened because of a discovery made at a place called Santa Ana, Florida, nestled in the foothills of the Andes. In 2018, a team of researchers published a landmark study showing that people at this site had been using cacao for over 5,000 years. They found tiny grains of starch from the cacao plant on ancient pottery. They detected the chemical fingerprint of cacao absorbed into the walls of ceramic vessels. And most remarkably, they recovered ancient plant material preserved in the residues clinging to the inside of pots that had sat undisturbed in the earth for thousands of years. This was not where anyone expected to find the world's oldest chocolate. For decades, scholars had assumed that the story of cacao began further north, in the tropical lowlands of what is now Mexico and Guatemala. The oldest evidence from that region came from pottery found in Honduras, dating to around 1400 years before the Common Era. The discovery in Ecuador pushed the origin story back by more than 1,000 years, and moved the birthplace of chocolate from Central America to South America, from the edges of the ancient Maya world to the heart of the Amazon. The people who lived at Santa Ana, Florida, belonged to a culture that flourished in the western Amazon over 5,000 years ago. They were not simple wanderers. They built stone structures, crafted fine pottery, and kept up trade networks that stretched from the Pacific coast across the mountains and into the jungle. The cacao vessels were found in homes and in the tombs of important people, which tells us something rather lovely, that cacao already held a place of honor at this very early time. Now, the tree itself is one of the strangest plants in the tropical forest. It evolved in the upper Amazon basin millions of years ago, in the region where modern Ecuador, Peru, and Colombia meet. Genetic studies have confirmed that this area holds the greatest variety of cacao types anywhere in the world, a strong sign that it is where the species first appeared. The tree is a creature of the shadows, growing beneath the canopy of taller rainforest trees, rarely reaching more than about 15 meters in height. Its most striking feature is something that might surprise you. The flowers and fruits do not grow from the tips of branches as they do on most trees. Instead, they sprout directly from the trunk and the older, thicker limbs. This gives a fruiting cacao tree an almost dreamlike appearance, as if dozens of colorful pods have been attached to its bark. Each pod is roughly the size of a small football, ripening from green to shades of yellow, orange, or deep reddish purple. Inside, the seeds are arranged in neat rows, wrapped in a layer of white pulp that tastes faintly of tropical fruit. But here is the thing worth knowing. None of that pulp tastes anything like chocolate. And if you were to bite into a raw cacao seed, you would taste nothing even close to the flavor the modern world knows so well. Raw cacao seeds are intensely bitter, filled with compounds that the tree evolved as defenses against insects and fungi. The journey from that unpleasant seed to something delicious requires a chain of changes, beginning with a slow process of natural breakdown that early Amazonians discovered through what was almost certainly accidental experimentation over many generations. The tree did not stay in the Amazon on its own. Studies of its genetic history have shown that cacao was carried along ancient trade routes thousands of years before Europeans arrived. The plant moved northward from its homeland through Central America and into the lands we now call Mexico, likely carried by traders and travelers who understood its value. This ancient corridor of exchange stretches back before written history and was only fully understood when modern scientists began comparing the genetic makeup of cacao trees across the whole of the Americas. Can you picture that for a moment? A seed gathered from the forest floor, tucked into a pouch and carried across mountains and rivers by someone who believed it was worth the trouble. We do not know their name. We do not know what language they spoke or what songs they sang as they walked. But that small act, repeated by countless hands across thousands of years, would set the stage for everything that followed. The empires that fought over it, the monks who whispered its recipe behind monastery walls, the ships that carried it across the sea, the factories that shaped it into bars, and the quiet pleasure of unwrapping a piece of chocolate on a cold evening. There are, by the way, a few different families of cacao that matter to this story. The oldest and most genetically varied type is what scientists call the hardy variety, the one that still grows wild in the Amazon and would eventually be planted on a massive scale across Africa. Then there is the more delicate type, the one that ancient Mesoamerican civilizations refined over thousands of years, producing a gentler, more complex flavor. It makes up only about 10% of the world's cacao today, but its roots trace all the way back to the same Amazonian gene pool. And there is a third type, a natural cross between the first two, which appeared on the island of Trinidad in the 1700s after a disaster wiped out the local cacao groves and new trees were brought in to replace them. That happy accident produced a tree that combined the best of both worlds, the flavor of one and the toughness of the other. But all of this, the naming, the classifying, the global industry built upon these trees, lay thousands of years in the future when the people of that Ecuadorian hillside first began working with cacao in the warm, damp air of the Amazon. What they knew was simpler and perhaps more meaningful. They had found something in the forest that, when prepared with care and patience, became a substance unlike anything else. And so our story begins, not with a factory or a brand name, but with a tree in the jungle and a person who decided that its bitter seeds were worth a second look. In the swampy lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, along the slow, muddy waters of a river near the Gulf Coast, something remarkable was happening nearly 4,000 years ago. The Olmec people, builders of one of the earliest great civilizations in the Americas, were drinking chocolate. The settlement of San Lorenzo, founded around 1500 years before the Common Era, was the largest and most powerful community in all of the region we now call Mesoamerica. Its people carved enormous stone heads, some weighing more than 20 tons, from boulders that had been dragged across dozens of kilometers of jungle and swamp. They developed early forms of writing and a calendar that would influence cultures for thousands of years to come. And when scientists examined their pottery, they found the unmistakable chemical trace of cacao absorbed into the clay. The evidence came from a careful study of over 150 pottery fragments recovered from the ruins of San Lorenzo and a nearby site. Researchers tested the insides of these ancient vessels for the telltale sign of cacao, and roughly 1 in every 6 samples came back positive. The earliest result pushed the date of Olmec chocolate drinking to somewhere between 1800 and 1600 years before the Common Era. That means the people of San Lorenzo were enjoying cacao almost from the very beginning of their city's life. The shapes of the vessels that tested positive tell us something too. They were open bowls and cups, the kind of thing you would drink from, not store grain in. One especially meaningful find came from a setting connected to ceremonies for the dead, which suggests that cacao was not just a pleasant drink but something tied to the most solemn moments of Olmec life. From its very first appearance in this part of the world, chocolate carried an air of importance. Now, there is something else worth knowing about the Olmec. They lived in exactly the right kind of place for cacao to grow. Their homeland along the Gulf Coast was warm, wet, and humid, with temperatures that rarely dropped low enough to threaten a tropical tree. It is likely that cacao trees were already growing wild or half-wild in the forests around them, and that the Olmec were among the first people in the region to tend and cultivate them on purpose. The language of the Olmec may also have given us the very word we use for this plant. Scholars have long believed that the Olmec spoke a language from a family that still survives in parts of southern Mexico today. In their reconstructions of that ancient language, linguists found a word that sounds remarkably like our word cacao. If they are right, then the name we give to the raw material of chocolate traces all the way back to the people of San Lorenzo, borrowed over the centuries into one language after another as cacao spread across the region. This theory has its critics, and the debate is not fully settled. Some linguists argue that the word came from a different language family entirely. But what no one disputes is that the word is very, very old, and that its spread across many different languages tracks closely with the spread of cacao itself. Can you imagine what that early Olmec chocolate tasted like? It was nothing like a modern cup of cocoa. There was no sugar, because sugarcane would not arrive in the Americas for another 3,000 years. The drink was bitter, perhaps flavored with chili peppers or vanilla or other local spices. The Olmec seemed to have poured it from one container to another, letting the liquid fall from a height to catch the air and create a layer of foam on top. That foam, as we will see again and again in this story, was considered the best part. The Olmec did not keep their discoveries to themselves. San Lorenzo sat at the center of a web of trade and cultural exchange that reached across much of southern Mesoamerica. Olmec-style objects, carved jade, fine pottery, and distinctive artistic forms have been found hundreds of kilometers from the Gulf Coast. It was through these connections that cacao likely traveled beyond its original home and into the hands of other peoples and other cultures. By around 900 years before the Common Era, San Lorenzo had begun to decline, and eventually the great city was abandoned. But the things the Olmec had set in motion, the art, the calendar, the writing, and the tradition of drinking chocolate lived on. Their successors would take what the Olmec had started and build upon it in ways the people of San Lorenzo could never have imagined. The Olmec gave the world many things. Those towering stone heads, some of the earliest writing in the Americas, a ball game that people would play for thousands of years. But perhaps their most lasting gift was one of the simplest. They showed that the bitter seed of a strange tropical tree, when prepared with care, could become something worth sharing. Every cup of chocolate you have ever tasted is, in a quiet way, an echo of that first Olmec cup, lifted to someone's lips nearly 4,000 years ago in the warm, heavy air of the Gulf Coast lowlands. And from those lowlands, the story of chocolate was about to travel further than anyone could have guessed. In 1984, deep in the tropical forests of northeastern Guatemala, archaeologists opened an ancient tomb and found the remains of a ruler who had been buried with 14 pottery vessels, supplies for his journey into the next world. One vessel in particular caught their attention. It was a handled pot with a dark ring stained around the inside, the ghost of a liquid that had long since dried away. Painted on the outside, in careful brushstrokes, were two symbols that spelled the ancient Maya word for cacao. When scientists tested the vessel, they confirmed what the writing promised. It had once held chocolate. The ruler buried in that tomb likely lived around 400 years after the Common Era, in the early days of what scholars call the Classic Maya period. But here is the detail that makes the find especially interesting. The writing on the pot seemed to refer to two different types of chocolate, perhaps named for the specific regions where the cacao was grown. It is a bit like finding an ancient wine bottle with a label that lists the vineyard and the vintage. The Maya, it seems, were not just drinking chocolate. They were paying attention to where it came from and what it tasted like, and they thought those details mattered enough to write them down. For the ancient Maya, cacao was woven into the very fabric of life. It appeared in their creation stories, their marriage ceremonies, their funerals, and their feasts. In the great creation narrative of one group of Maya people, cacao is listed among the foods that the gods used to make human beings. Another story describes the head of the maize god, the most important figure in Maya belief, hanging from what appears to be a cacao tree. The boundary between food and faith was thin, and cacao sat right on that line. Maya art gives us some of the most vivid glimpses of how chocolate was prepared and enjoyed. One famous painted vase, created around 750 years after the Common Era, shows a woman pouring a chocolate drink from one raised vessel into another below. The liquid cascades through the air, catching it, becoming frothy and full of bubbles. That foam was considered the finest part of the drink, and the act of creating it was a kind of performance, a ritual gesture that turned a simple liquid into something worthy of ceremony. The chocolate that the Maya drank was nothing like what sits on store shelves today. It was always a liquid, never a solid. It was served at room temperature or slightly warm. The base was ground cacao mixed with water, but to this they added all sorts of things: chili peppers for heat, a natural red dye from a plant called achiote, vanilla, honey, and fragrant flowers. Some versions included ground corn, which thickened the drink into something closer to a porridge. The result was a complex, savory, spicy, slightly bitter drink topped with a tall head of reddish-brown foam. It was a drink that required skill to make and a trained palate to appreciate. Not everyone got to drink it. Cacao was closely tied to the ruling class, to the royal courts, and to the moments that marked the most important turning points in a person's life. When two families came together for a marriage, cacao was shared between them, a tradition so deeply rooted that some scholars believe the Maya word for marriage may have been related to the word for drinking chocolate together. When a ruler died, as we saw in that Guatemalan tomb, prepared chocolate was placed beside the body to sustain them on their journey through the land of the dead. The Maya had a god who watched over both merchants and cacao growers, a fitting combination given that cacao was both one of the most valuable trade goods and one of the most important crops in the Maya world. He is shown in surviving Maya books as a dark-skinned figure with a distinctive reddish border around his mouth and a large lower lip. The Maya held a yearly festival in his honor, during which they offered cacao drinks, incense, feathers, and even the sacrifice of dogs whose fur had been dyed the color of chocolate. The surviving Maya books, painted on bark paper and folded like screens, are among the few records of Maya civilization that escaped destruction during the Spanish colonial period. In their pages, cacao appears again and again, as pods, as seeds, as trees, and as prepared drinks held by the gods themselves. These fragile documents are some of the most direct evidence we have of just how central chocolate was to Maya spiritual life. The Maya were skilled traders as well. During the Classic period, from roughly 250 to 900 years after the Common Era, they developed sprawling trade networks connecting the lowland forests where cacao grew to highland communities that could not grow the tree themselves. Cacao moved along rivers, coastal paths, and overland trails, packed in bundles and carried on the backs of porters. Evidence of cacao has been found at sites far from the growing regions, proof that the trade in prepared chocolate extended across hundreds of kilometers. By the time the great classic Maya cities began to decline, around the 8th and 9th centuries, cacao had been at the heart of Mesoamerican culture for well over 2,000 years. But the decline of those cities did not mean the end of Maya chocolate. In the centuries that followed, Maya communities continued to grow, trade, and drink cacao across a wide area. And now, from the east, a new power was rising. The people of the central Mexican highlands, who would build the largest empire Mesoamerica had ever seen, were about to discover just how valuable a small, bitter seed could be. In the great marketplace of the Aztec capital, a man once carefully counted out 30 cacao beans and handed them to a vendor in exchange for a small rabbit. Down the row, another buyer parted with 3 beans for a single turkey egg. Nearby, a wealthy nobleman negotiated the purchase of a slave for 100 beans. These transactions, recorded in a price list written just a few decades after the Spanish conquest, reveal one of the most unusual monetary systems in human history, one in which the basic unit of currency was not a metal coin or a slip of paper, but a small, perishable seed that grew on a tropical tree. Cacao beans served as money across Mesoamerica for at least 2,000 years, from the time of the ancient Maya through the fall of the Aztec Empire, and remarkably for several decades afterward. The system worked because cacao beans possessed many of the qualities that make a good currency. They were roughly the same size and shape. They were light enough to carry in large numbers. They lasted long enough to survive weeks of travel and trade. And they had real value on their own, both as the raw material for the prized chocolate drink and as a symbol of wealth and standing. The price lists left behind by colonial-era record keepers give us a wonderfully detailed picture of what things cost in the cacao economy. A male turkey went for 300 beans. A small rabbit, as we heard, cost 30. A turkey egg cost 3. And hiring a porter for a single trip cost 20. More sobering entries tell us that a human being could be bought for 100 beans. For larger purchases, cacao beans were joined by other forms of payment, cotton cloths, copper blades, and small tubes filled with gold dust, all linked to cacao by agreed-upon exchange rates. The Aztecs faced a particular challenge with their cacao currency. They could not grow the tree. Their capital, built on an island in a lake at an altitude of over 2,000 meters, was far too cold and dry for a tropical plant that needed warmth, shade, and humidity. The cacao-growing regions lay hundreds of kilometers to the south and east, in the hot lowlands along the Gulf Coast and in the forests of what is now Guatemala. This meant that the Aztec hunger for cacao could only be satisfied through trade and tribute, and the empire's expansion was driven in part by the desire to control the lands where cacao grew. The tribute system was the main way cacao reached the capital. Conquered provinces were required to deliver set amounts of goods at regular intervals, and cacao was among the most demanded items. One surviving tribute record lists the quantities demanded from each region, and the numbers are striking. Some provinces had to deliver hundreds of loads of cacao beans every year, with each load weighing roughly 24,000 beans. The sheer volume of cacao flowing into the capital was enormous, feeding both the elite appetite for chocolate drinks and the everyday workings of commerce. Now, where there is money, there are counterfeiters, and Mesoamerican cacao was no exception. One of the most colorful details in the entire history of chocolate is the practice of faking cacao beans. A Spanish friar who spent years documenting Aztec life described the methods in vivid detail. Counterfeiters would carefully hollow out real cacao beans and fill the empty shells with substitutes, including dough made from ground seeds, wax, bits of avocado pit, and plain mud. The filled shells were then sealed to look like the real thing. Some forgers went even further, shaping entirely fake beans from clay or other materials. The practice was common enough that the Aztec language contained several specific words for counterfeit cacao, which tells us that everyone knew it was happening and talked about it often. Archaeologists have found clay imitation beans at sites in both Mexico and Guatemala, confirming that this was not just a colorful story but an organized activity. Here is something else worth pausing on. Because cacao beans were perishable, they could not be hoarded the way gold or silver could. Beans left unused would eventually rot, grow mold, or sprout. This built-in expiration date placed a natural limit on how much wealth anyone could simply sit on. If your money was going to go bad, you had an incentive to spend it, trade it, or convert it into something more lasting. Some scholars have suggested that this perishability actually encouraged a more active, more circulating economy, which is a rather elegant feature for a monetary system invented thousands of years before anyone wrote a textbook on economics. The Spanish conquest of 1521 did not immediately end the use of cacao as currency. For decades after the fall of the Aztec Empire, cacao beans continued to change hands alongside Spanish coins in the markets of the new colony. The colonial government tolerated this because Spanish coins were scarce in many areas and the cacao system kept trade flowing. Only gradually, as metal currency became more available, did cacao's role as money fade, though it lingered in some rural corners well into the 1600s. The word chocolate itself may trace back to the Aztec language, possibly combining words meaning bitter and water, though the exact origin is debated. What is beyond debate is that cacao held a position in Mesoamerican life unlike anything else. It was food, drink, currency, ritual offering, and symbol of divine favor all at once. No other substance in the ancient Americas, and perhaps nowhere else in the world before the modern age, served so many purposes at the same time. And when the Spanish arrived and watched cacao beans being used as money, they were both amused and impressed. A currency that literally grew on trees struck some of them as wonderfully convenient. The irony, of course, is that within a few centuries, their own descendants would invent financial instruments far more abstract and far more easily faked than a hollow cacao bean filled with mud. But before the Spanish could take chocolate home to Europe, they first had to encounter it in the court of the most powerful man in the Americas, a ruler whose obsession with the bitter drink would become one of history's most famous stories. On a November afternoon in 1519, a Spanish soldier stood in the great palace of the Aztec emperor in the heart of the largest city in the Americas and watched the most powerful ruler on the continent eat his evening meal. The scene stayed with him for the rest of his life, and decades later, writing his memoirs, he described it in careful detail. Among the things that struck him most was the emperor's choice of drink. He recorded that more than 50 large pitchers of cacao, topped with foam, were brought in, and that the emperor drank from cups of pure gold. He noted further that 2,000 containers of chocolate were consumed daily by the imperial guard alone, a number so large that historians have debated its accuracy ever since. The emperor's name was Montezuma II, and his love of chocolate was legendary even by the standards of his own court. Several sources describe him drinking up to 50 golden goblets of the stuff each day. He reportedly sipped his chocolate from a balcony overlooking the waters of the lake on which his capital was built, and after finishing each cup, he would toss the golden vessel into the water, a gesture of wealth so casual it bordered on contempt. The Aztec name for their chocolate drink translates roughly as bitter water, and that is exactly what it was. It was nothing like the warm, sweet, milky cocoa the modern world knows. It was a cold, intensely bitter, deeply complex drink. The base was ground roasted cacao paste mixed with water, often combined with chili peppers, vanilla, a red plant-based dye, allspice, and sometimes ground corn. The mixture was worked vigorously, either by stirring with a carved wooden stick or by pouring the liquid from one vessel to another held high above, letting the stream catch the air. The foam that rose from this pouring was considered the finest part of the drink. Spanish observers noted that the liquid was poured back and forth between containers until a thick froth appeared, and that when drinking, one had to open one's mouth wide to let the foam settle. The Aztecs had a vocabulary for different qualities of foam, and the skill of the person who made it was judged entirely by the thickness, color, and staying power of that frothy crown. Chocolate was not for everyone. In the strict ranks of Aztec society, cacao drinking was reserved for the nobility, the warrior class, and the priests. Common people were generally forbidden from having it, except during certain religious festivals when the rules were briefly relaxed. Warriors who had proven themselves in battle were rewarded with cacao, and the drink was consumed before military campaigns as both a source of energy and a ritual preparation for what lay ahead. The link between cacao and warfare ran deep in Aztec culture, with chocolate serving as fuel for the body and nourishment for the fighting spirit. The great marketplace near the center of the capital was one of the largest trading centers in the world at that time. When the Spanish first visited, they estimated that 60,000 people traded there every day. Cacao was one of the most important goods available, offered in various grades and preparations. Vendors sold ready-made cacao paste, whole beans of different qualities, and cups of prepared chocolate in different flavors. A Spanish friar who spent decades recording the details of Aztec life after the conquest left descriptions of the vendors who specialized in cacao, noting the range of flavors and recipes on offer. That same friar was told by his Aztec informants that cacao was considered good for success with women, a tantalizing claim that has been read in many ways. It might mean that the Aztecs saw chocolate as something that stirred desire. It might mean that the ability to serve fine chocolate was a mark of the kind of status that made a person attractive. Whatever the exact meaning, the connection between chocolate and romance is very old indeed, far older than the Valentine's Day cards and heart-shaped boxes that would come many centuries later. Making chocolate was a skilled craft, and it was primarily the work of women. The process began with roasting the cacao beans, then grinding them on a flat stone until they became a smooth paste. This paste was mixed with water and the desired flavorings, and the whole thing was worked until silky. The final step, the frothing, required particular expertise. A poorly frothed cup of chocolate was considered an embarrassment, and a well-made one was a source of genuine pride. The Aztec relationship with cacao was shaped, in a way that feels almost poetic, by a fundamental problem of geography. The Aztec heartland sat in a high mountain valley, over 2,000 meters above sea level, far too cold and dry for a tropical tree that needed warmth, shade, and moisture. The cacao-growing lands lay hundreds of kilometers to the south and east in the hot lowlands along the coast and in the forests of what is now Guatemala. And so the empire expanded, driven in part by the desire to control those distant groves. The tribute system carried cacao to the capital in enormous quantities, but the dependence on faraway growing regions created a vulnerability. The empire responded with military outposts to guard trade routes, diplomatic marriages to keep allies close, and vast storehouses where cacao could be kept in reserve. The importance of cacao to the Aztec state can be measured by the sheer size of the system built to keep it flowing. And it was into this world, this civilization built partly upon the bitter seed of a tropical tree, that a small band of Spanish soldiers was about to walk, carrying with them weapons, ambition, and a hunger for gold that would change everything. On a painted pottery vessel from the 8th century, a Maya artist captured a scene that blurs the line between the human world and the divine. A woman kneels before a great cacao tree, its pods hanging heavy from the trunk. Beside her, a figure identified as the young god of corn and grain emerges from the realm of the dead, his body becoming the trunk of the tree itself. The cacao pods, in this image, are not simply fruit. They are the body of a resurrected god, the visible proof that death is not the end, that sacrifice can bring abundance, and that the boundary between the living and the dead can be crossed through the medium of cacao. For at least 3,000 years across Mesoamerica, cacao held a place between the ordinary and the holy that very few substances have ever matched. It was food, it was money, it was medicine, and it was a way to speak with the gods. The gods were shown drinking it in painted scenes. Humans offered it to the gods in ceremony. The dead were sent off with it for the journey ahead. And the living drank it at every moment that marked a passage from one state of being to another: birth, marriage, the taking of power, and death. The god most closely tied to cacao in the Maya world served a double role as the protector of both merchants and cacao growers. This made a kind of poetic sense, given that cacao was at once a sacred plant and a valuable trade good. In the few surviving painted Maya books, he appears as a dark-skinned figure, sometimes striped in black and white, with a reddish border around his mouth and a single tooth. an image of patience and endurance that felt fitting for a tree that takes 5 years to produce its first harvest. The Maya held yearly festivals in his honor. The celebrations were elaborate and expensive. Offerings included prepared chocolate drinks, drops of blood drawn through small ritual piercings, incense made from tree resin, feathers, and according to some accounts, the sacrifice of dogs whose fur had been dyed the color of cacao beans. These festivals were both spiritual and practical. They asked the god for protection over the cacao crop, for good fortune in trade, and for the continued flow of cacao that held the community together. The great creation story of one group of Maya people provides the deepest glimpse into why cacao was considered sacred. In the story, 2 young heroes descend into the realm of death to avenge their father, who had been killed by the lords of that dark place. The father's head was hung in a tree where it became something like a fruit, a cacao pod in some tellings. A young woman approached the tree, and the head breathed life into her, giving her the twin sons who would eventually defeat death itself. The tale links cacao directly to sacrifice, to rebirth, and to the idea that life can emerge even from the darkest place. It is a powerful myth, and it helps explain why cacao was treated with such reverence for so many centuries. Maya artists return to these themes again and again. Painted vessels from the classic period, many of them made specifically to be buried with the dead, show scenes of chocolate being prepared, chocolate being drunk, and chocolate appearing in the company of gods. One famous vase from around 750 years after the Common Era shows a palace scene in which a woman pours chocolate between 2 vessels to create foam, while figures from beyond the human world look on. The use of cacao in ritual went far beyond festivals and feasting. Among the Maya, cacao was present at nearly every turning point in a person's life. When a marriage was arranged, the families of the couple shared cacao together, and the drinking of chocolate was considered an essential part of the agreement. The act of sharing a cup of cacao sealed promises, created bonds, and carried the weight of something approaching a legal contract. At funerals, as we saw in that Guatemalan tomb from an earlier part of our story, cacao vessels were placed beside the body. The chocolate in those vessels was real, genuine prepared cacao, meant to sustain the dead person on their journey through the underworld. Mourners at the funeral were given cacao to drink as well, a gesture that honored the departed, comforted the living, and kept alive the connection between the 2 worlds. The Aztecs, when they rose to power, took these traditions and shaped them to fit their own beliefs. In their stories, cacao was a gift from one of the most important gods in their world, a figure known as the feathered serpent. According to the myth, this god stole the cacao tree from the other gods and gave it to humanity. For this act of cosmic generosity, he was punished, but the gift could not be taken back. Humanity kept the knowledge of cacao, and with it, a link to the divine. The Aztecs also connected cacao to the goddess of love, beauty, and flowers, creating an association between chocolate and desire that would prove remarkably long-lasting. And in their most solemn ceremonies, those that involved the sacrifice of human life, chocolate was sometimes given to the person who was about to die. It was their final drink, a gesture that combined honor, compassion, and the belief that cacao was the proper food for someone about to cross from one world into the next. Even today, in many communities across southern Mexico and Guatemala, cacao still holds a place in traditional ceremony. It is shared at weddings, offered at funerals, and given to the earth and the ancestors in acts of thanks. The sacred status of chocolate, first established in those tropical forests thousands of years ago, has proven to be one of the most enduring threads in the story we are telling tonight. And yet, for all its spiritual power, chocolate was about to meet a force that would change its story forever. Not a god or a myth, but a ship full of soldiers arriving from across the sea. In the summer of 1502, during his 4th and final voyage across the Atlantic, Christopher Columbus encountered a large wooden canoe near an island off the coast of what is now Honduras. It was the biggest native vessel the Spanish had ever seen, as long as one of their own warships, with a cabin in the middle shaded by a canopy of woven palm leaves. The canoe was loaded with trade goods, cotton garments, copper bells, stone blades, and a great quantity of what the Spanish took to be some kind of almond. These were cacao beans, and when some of them spilled during the encounter, the people in the canoe scrambled to pick them up with an urgency that baffled the Europeans. They acted, one observer wrote, as though they had dropped something of tremendous value. Columbus, whose mind was fixed on finding a sea route to Asia, did not look into the matter any further. He brought some of the beans back to Spain, but they attracted no interest at court, lost among the gold, silver, and other curiosities that seemed far more obviously important. It would be another 17 years before Europeans truly understood what the people of Mesoamerica had known for centuries, that those small, unremarkable beans were the foundation of something extraordinary. The real introduction came in 1519, when a Spanish soldier and adventurer from a small town in western Spain landed on the coast of the Yucatan and began his march toward the Aztec capital. He first encountered cacao in the lowland regions, where he met Maya communities that grew and drank it. But it was not until he reached the court of the Aztec emperor that he grasped the full scale of what cacao meant in this part of the world. The meeting between this Spanish captain and the Aztec ruler is one of the most written about moments in human history. One of the soldiers who was there, a common foot soldier who wrote his account many years later, described the elaborate feasts in detail. He noted the staggering variety of dishes, the gold and jade ornaments, the flowers everywhere, and above all, the chocolate. He recorded that from time to time, a special drink made from cacao, said to have a strengthening quality, was brought to the emperor in cups of pure gold. The Spanish reaction to the drink was, at first, one of pure distaste. The bitter, spicy, unsweetened liquid bore no resemblance to anything in European experience. One early observer described it, rather unkindly, as a drink more fit for pigs than for people. The cold temperature, the unfamiliar spice, the thick and foamy texture, all of it felt strange to men who had grown up on wine and bread in the dry plains of central Spain. But these were practical men, and as they settled into their new colony, they began to understand why the people they had conquered valued cacao so highly. The turning point came when colonists, and particularly Spanish women arriving in the new territory, began to adapt the recipe. They added sugar, which was already being grown on Caribbean plantations. They added cinnamon, a spice they knew from home. They served the drink warm instead of cold. And they left out the chili peppers that gave the original its fiery bite. The result was something transformed, still recognizably chocolate, but now sweetened, spiced, and heated into a form that European mouths could welcome. This adaptation did not happen overnight. For much of the 1500s, the original Mesoamerican style of preparation existed alongside the newer European version. Some Spanish colonists adopted the native way entirely, becoming devoted fans of the traditional drink. Others experimented with mixtures of Old World and New World ingredients that would have puzzled both Aztec and European traditions. A particularly important moment came in 1544, when a group of Maya nobles was brought to the Spanish court by a group of friars. The Maya visitors presented prepared chocolate to the young prince who would one day become king. For many at court, it was their very first taste of the exotic American drink, and the presentation was carefully arranged to show chocolate at its finest. The favorable impression it made helped establish the drink's reputation among the Spanish upper classes. The Spanish captain who led the conquest has often been credited with bringing chocolate to Europe, and while the exact timeline is a matter of debate, he certainly promoted cacao's commercial value. In letters to the Spanish crown, he described the central role of cacao in the Aztec economy and suggested that it could be developed into a profitable colonial product. He recognized that cacao was not just a curiosity, but something with real economic potential, and his recommendation helped set in motion the colonial industry that would follow. The fall of the Aztec Empire in 1521 marked the end of an independent civilization and the beginning of chocolate's transformation from a sacred drink into a global commodity. The colonial government moved quickly to control cacao production, setting up plantations worked by local people under conditions that ranged from harsh to outright brutal. A system of forced labor was imposed on cacao growing, establishing a pattern of exploitation that would shadow the chocolate trade for centuries to come. There is an irony here worth pausing on. In destroying the Aztec world, the Spanish actually preserved and spread one of its most distinctive creations. Without the conquest, chocolate might have remained a tradition of this one corner of the globe. Instead, it was carried across the ocean, planted in new tropical lands, and set on a path to becoming one of the most widely enjoyed flavors on Earth. The bitter drink of the Aztec emperor, reshaped by colonial ambition and European taste, was about to begin a journey its creators could never have imagined. And for nearly 100 years, that journey would remain Spain's secret alone. Behind the thick stone walls of a monastery in the dry highlands of northeastern Spain, monks in white robes tended to an extraordinary secret. According to tradition, their monastery was the first place in all of Spain where chocolate was prepared. The monks ground cacao beans on flat stones, much as the Aztecs had done an ocean away, but they added sugar and cinnamon to the bitter paste, creating a drink that bore only a passing resemblance to the original. They served it to visiting dignitaries, shared it with one another, and kept the knowledge of its preparation with the quiet discretion for which their religious order was known. For nearly 100 years after cacao first crossed the Atlantic, chocolate remained an almost exclusively Spanish possession. From roughly the 1520s until the early 1600s, Spain held a near-total monopoly on chocolate coming into Europe, and the knowledge of how to prepare the drink stayed within a fairly small circle of colonists, monks, nuns, and members of the upper class. This was not the result of any grand conspiracy or government decree. It was simply the natural outcome of the fact that Spain controlled the lands where cacao grew, and the rest of Europe had not yet developed a taste for the unfamiliar drink. The transformation of chocolate into something Europeans would love happened slowly over decades in the kitchens of Spanish households, monasteries, and convents across both the colony and the homeland. The most important change was the addition of sugar, which softened the bitterness that had made the original drink so difficult for newcomers to enjoy. Cinnamon took the place of the chili peppers, offering a familiar warmth without the searing heat. Vanilla itself, another gift from the Americas, added a layer of fragrant sweetness. And the drink was served hot, a simple but fundamental shift that turned a room temperature tonic into a warming comfort perfectly suited to the cooler air of the Spanish peninsula. Monasteries and convents played an outsized role in the early life of European chocolate. Nuns in colonial convents became expert chocolate makers, producing solid sweet preparations that were sold as delicacies and turned a healthy profit. The connection between chocolate and religious houses made practical sense. These institutions had the organization to process cacao in large quantities, the trade networks to sell the finished product, and the culture of secrecy to protect the recipes they had developed. The Spanish crown, recognizing the commercial promise of chocolate, entrusted much of its production to these religious communities. Within the royal court, chocolate quickly became a mark of sophistication and high status. The aristocracy drank it in elaborate settings using specially designed silver and ceramic chocolate services. Trained servants prepared it, and offering chocolate to a guest was an expression of both hospitality and wealth. The Spanish also invented a new tool for making the drink, a carved wooden stirring stick with raised rings that was twirled between the palms to whip up the foam, replacing the Aztec method of pouring the liquid from a height. This little device, simple as it was, became a standard part of chocolate preparation across the Spanish-speaking world and beyond. The colonial system kept the supply flowing. Plantations were established across Mesoamerica and the Caribbean islands, worked first by local people under systems of forced labor and later by enslaved Africans, as the native population was devastated by European diseases. The coastal valleys of what is now Venezuela became a particularly important growing region, developing a reputation for cacao of exceptional quality. The cacao trade grew into one of the most profitable parts of the Spanish colonial economy, and the beans themselves became as valuable as some of the more famous colonial exports. But secrets, especially delicious ones, have a way of escaping. Spanish monks traveling to other parts of Europe carried their knowledge of chocolate with them. Marriages between the Spanish royal family and other European courts created channels for cultural exchange. And the sheer volume of cacao passing through Spanish ports made it harder and harder to keep the trade confined to one country. Italian merchants who visited Spain tasted chocolate and brought samples and recipes home. Portuguese traders, busy with their own colonial ventures in Brazil and Africa, began developing their own cacao supply chains. By the early 1600s, the walls around Spain's chocolate secret were starting to crack. The drink had appeared in Italy, where the upper classes embraced it and adapted it with characteristic flair. French courtiers had encountered it through diplomatic ties with Spain. Dutch and English merchants, always eager competitors in the race for colonial goods, were beginning to get their hands on cacao through both fair trade and outright piracy. The age of Spain's private chocolate affair was drawing to a close. That century of Spanish exclusivity left a lasting mark. The Spanish way of making chocolate, sweetened with sugar and scented with cinnamon, became the template from which every European chocolate tradition would evolve. The ties between chocolate and religious life, forged in those quiet monastery kitchens, would echo down the centuries. And the plantation system that Spain had built to feed its appetite for cacao established a grim pattern of forced labor that would only deepen as demand grew. Spain never set out to hide chocolate from the world on purpose. It simply happened to be the first European power to lay claim to the lands where cacao grew. For nearly 100 years, the country had this extraordinary drink to itself, and during that time it took a bitter Mesoamerican drink and turned it into something new, a European luxury, a colonial commodity, and the ancestor of every cup of hot chocolate, every candy bar, and every chocolate truffle the world would ever know. And now, at last, the secret was out. Chocolate was about to cross the mountains and sweep across the rest of Europe, carried by royal marriages, merchant ships, and the simple, irresistible power of a very good drink. In 1615, a 14-year-old Spanish princess crossed the mountains between Spain and France to marry the 13-year-old king of France. She brought with her a large group of Spanish attendants, a wardrobe fit for a queen, and a deep love of chocolate that would help change the tastes of an entire country. She had grown up drinking chocolate in the refined manner of the Spanish upper class, and she was not about to give up the habit simply because she had moved to a new court. Her arrival in France marks one of the most important moments in the European story of chocolate, the point at which the drink finally began to escape the grip of Spain and enter the wider world. She was not the only person who helped spread chocolate across Europe, but she was among the most influential. Through her example and the example of the Spanish women who accompanied her, chocolate drinking was introduced to the French court, where it was quickly taken up as a fashionable novelty. The French, with their well-known attention to the pleasures of the table, soon began developing their own versions of the Spanish recipe. They added perfumed ingredients like jasmine and a waxy substance taken from the sea that smelled faintly of the ocean, additions that would have puzzled anyone in ancient Mesoamerica. Italy, too, had been introduced to chocolate through its trading connections with Spain. Merchants in the great commercial cities of Florence, Venice, and Genoa had tasted chocolate during their dealings with Spanish partners and brought it home as a luxury import. The city of Turin, in the hills of northern Italy, became an early center of Italian chocolate culture, developing preparations that reflected the city's long tradition of fine food. By the middle of the 1600s, chocolate had taken its place in the courts and sitting rooms of Italian high society. Now, the spread of chocolate across Europe was accompanied by a debate that sounds almost comical today, but was taken very seriously at the time. The question was whether drinking chocolate counted as breaking the Catholic fast. This was not a minor concern. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the Catholic calendar required fasting on a great many days each year, during which the faithful were forbidden from eating between midnight and the taking of communion. An exception was made for drinks taken to ease thirst, as long as they did not provide real nourishment. So the issue came down to a simple but surprisingly difficult question: was chocolate a food or a drink? If it was a food, then having it during a fast was a sin. If it was simply a drink, then it was perfectly fine. The argument went back and forth for over a century, drawing in some of the sharpest theological minds in the Catholic world. One religious order campaigned to have chocolate classified as a food and sent representatives to Rome to press their case. A theologian published a defense of chocolate as an acceptable refreshment during fasting. And in 1636, a lawyer for the Inquisition wrote an entire book on the subject, asking whether chocolate broke the fast. The debate was finally put to rest in 1662 when a high-ranking church official issued a ruling that settled the matter. His reasoning was elegant in its simplicity. Wine, he pointed out, was clearly nourishing, and yet it was allowed during the fast. The same logic, he said, applied to chocolate. With that, the question was closed, and Catholics across Europe could drink their chocolate without worrying about their souls. The resolution of this question removed one of the last obstacles to chocolate's spread. By the second half of the 1600s, the drink had reached every major European court and was beginning to trickle down from the aristocracy to the wealthier members of the merchant class. Each country adapted the recipe to its own liking. The Spanish kept to their traditional mix of sugar and cinnamon. The French added flowers, perfumes, and sometimes eggs. The Italians experimented with citrus and jasmine. The English, as was their way, would soon turn the whole thing into a business. Chocolate traveled from country to country by many paths. Royal marriages, like the one that brought that Spanish princess to France, carried the drink from one court to the next. Diplomatic gifts of cacao or prepared chocolate introduced it to foreign leaders. Merchant networks, especially the Italian and Dutch trading houses, moved cacao as a commercial product. And monks and missionaries, who had been among the first Europeans to learn how to make chocolate in the colonies, carried their knowledge back to religious houses across the continent. One religious order played a particularly notable role. The Jesuits ran missions throughout the cacao-growing regions of the Americas and were deeply involved in the cacao trade. Their international network of schools, missions, and houses provided a ready-made system for distributing both cacao beans and the knowledge of how to use them. Through the Jesuits, chocolate reached parts of Europe, including Germany and Austria, that had no direct connection to the lands where cacao grew. By 1700, chocolate was available, at least to those who could afford it, in almost every European capital. It was drunk in private homes, in the rooms of the nobility, and increasingly in a new kind of gathering place that was beginning to change the social landscape of European cities. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Madrid, dedicated houses where one could sit and drink chocolate were opening their doors, offering the exotic drink to anyone with the price of a cup. The age of chocolate as a Spanish secret was well and truly over. The age of chocolate as a European passion was just beginning, and nowhere would that passion burn more brightly or more politically than in the city of London. In 1657, a man whose name has been lost to history opened a small shop in a narrow alley just off one of the main streets in the city of London and began selling a curious beverage to anyone willing to pay. His advertisement promised an excellent drink from the West Indies called chocolate and described its powers in the grand, sweeping language of the time. This unnamed shopkeeper's establishment was the first dedicated chocolate house in London, and it marked the start of a remarkable chapter in British life, a period in which chocolate houses became the unofficial meeting rooms of the nation's political and literary world. Chocolate arrived in England at a moment of extraordinary upheaval. The English Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier. A king had been executed. The country was still sorting out the balance of power between the government, the crown, and the people. In this charged atmosphere, the new public houses devoted to exotic drinks, whether coffee, tea, or chocolate, became places for debate, for scheming, and for the exchange of ideas. They were rooms where people of different backgrounds could mingle, where news was shared, where political friendships were formed, and where the limits of what could be said in public were constantly being tested. The chocolate houses carved out a special place in this world. While the coffee houses attracted a broader crowd of traders and thinkers, the chocolate houses tended to be more exclusive, more expensive, and more closely tied to the aristocracy and the political elite. A cup of chocolate cost more than a cup of coffee, and that difference in price helped create an atmosphere of genteel selectiveness that set the chocolate house apart from its more democratic rival. The most famous of all London's chocolate houses was established in 1693 by an Italian immigrant who gave it his own name, though he changed it to sound more English. Located on a fashionable street in the West End, it quickly became the unofficial gathering place of one of the two great political factions of the day. A famous writer of the time called it the ruin of the English nobility, a reference to the ferocious gambling that went on inside. Others called it the most fashionable gambling den in London, a place where entire fortunes were won and lost over cups of chocolate and hands of cards. But it was far more than a gambling hall. It was a center of political power, a place where politicians planned their next moves, where deals were struck and broken, and where the direction of the country's affairs was sometimes decided between sips of chocolate. The establishment's role as a political clubhouse was so well established that when it eventually transformed from a public chocolate house into a private gentleman's club in the 1700s, it kept its political character. It still operates today on the same street, making it the oldest gentleman's club in London, a direct descendant of the chocolate house that opened over 300 years ago. Just across the narrow street stood another famous chocolate house, which became the gathering place for the opposing political faction. Where the first was home to one party, this one belonged to the other, and the two establishments stared at each other across the pavement like rival fortresses. This second house attracted a different but equally distinguished crowd, including the historian who wrote the famous account of the fall of the Roman Empire and the poet who became one of the icons of the Romantic Age. It also carried a more secretive reputation. Rumor had it that supporters of the exiled royal family met there in secret, and a hidden tunnel was supposedly found leading away from the building, fueling stories of covert meetings and whispered plots. Other chocolate houses served other corners of London's elite. Some catered to the very highest ranks of the aristocracy. One operated within the grounds of a royal palace. These were not simply places to drink. They were institutions where the business of power, money, and influence was carried out in an atmosphere of careful informality. Which chocolate house a person chose to visit was itself a public statement of where they stood on the great questions of the day. To be seen at the wrong one could be as damaging to a reputation as a public scandal. The chocolate houses served purposes beyond politics as well. They were centers of literary culture where writers and critics gathered to read, discuss, and argue. They were meeting points for business, where merchants and financiers negotiated over shared pots of chocolate. They were places of entertainment, where music was played, newspapers were read aloud, and the day's gossip was traded with wit and sharpness. In a time before dedicated theaters, concert halls, and offices were common, the chocolate house served all of these roles at once. The golden age of the London chocolate house lasted roughly a century, from the 1660s to the 1770s. Several things brought it to an end. The rise of private gentlemen's clubs, many of which grew directly out of the chocolate houses themselves, drew the wealthy clientele behind closed doors. The changes brought by the coming industrial age began to transform chocolate from a luxury drink into something more widely available, and in doing so stripped away the exclusivity that had been central to the chocolate house's appeal. And tea, which was cheaper, easier to make, and could be enjoyed at home without special equipment, gradually took chocolate's place as the fashionable hot drink of choice. But the legacy of those chocolate houses lived on long after the last cup was poured. The gentlemen's clubs that replaced them inherited both the buildings and the traditions. The idea of using a comfortable social space as a forum for political discussion, literary exchange, and the conduct of business carried forward into British life for centuries. Every private club in the world, from London to New York, owes something to those chocolate houses of 17th century England, where the simple act of sharing a cup of something warm became a way of shaping the course of a nation. And while the London elite sipped and debated, a quiet revolution in understanding was taking place in the world of natural science, as scholars turned their attention to the remarkable tree that made all of this possible. When the great Swedish naturalist set out to give the cacao tree its formal scientific name in 1753, he chose something no other plant in his entire system received. He called it the food of the gods. It was an unusual moment of poetry from a man not given to poetic excess in his scientific work, and yet the name has proven strangely apt, because the cacao tree is, by almost any measure, one of the most remarkable organisms in the plant kingdom. The cacao tree is a tropical evergreen that grows naturally only within a narrow belt around the middle of the earth, roughly 20 degrees north and south of the equator. It is a creature of the shadows, built for life beneath the canopy of taller rainforest trees, and it does not do well in direct sunlight. It needs steady rainfall, high humidity, and warmth that stays between about 21 and 32 degrees throughout the year. Even a brief dip below 10 degrees can harm or kill it. These demanding requirements explain why cacao is grown in only a handful of tropical places and why every attempt to grow it elsewhere has ended in disappointment. But the truly striking thing about the cacao tree is the way it grows its fruit. On most trees, flowers and fruits appear at the tips of young branches, up where the sun and wind can reach them. The cacao tree does things differently. Its flowers and pods sprout directly from the trunk and the older, thicker limbs. This gives a fruiting cacao tree an almost dreamlike appearance, as if someone has carefully hung dozens of colorful pods along the bark. The sight of it is enough to make you stop and stare, even if you have seen it many times before. Why does the tree grow this way? The answer is not entirely settled, but it may have something to do with how the tree is pollinated. The tiny creatures responsible, midges no larger than a pinhead, tend to live close to the ground, in the still damp air near the forest floor. By growing its flowers low on the trunk, the tree puts them within easy reach of these small visitors. The flowers themselves are wonderfully small, less than 2 centimeters across, and they bloom in enormous numbers. A single tree may produce 10,000 or more flowers in a year, but only a tiny fraction of them will ever become fruit. The success rate is shockingly low, usually somewhere between 1 and 5 out of every 100 flowers. This makes cacao one of the least efficiently pollinated of all the crops that humans grow. Scientists have spent decades trying to understand and improve this process because it is one of the key bottlenecks in chocolate production. When a flower is successfully pollinated, it slowly develops into a cacao pod. The pod is roughly the size of a small football, and it ripens to shades of yellow, orange, red, or deep purple, depending on the variety. Unlike most fruit, it does not fall from the tree when it is ready. Someone must cut it free by hand. Inside each pod, arranged in 5 neat rows, are 20 to 60 seeds, each about the size of a large almond, wrapped in a layer of white, slippery pulp that tastes faintly of lychee or passion fruit. Now here is where the real magic begins. That sweet, tangy pulp is the key to everything. When cacao pods are harvested and opened, the seeds and pulp are scooped out and placed together in heaps or wooden boxes. Almost immediately, something begins to happen. Tiny organisms in the air, yeasts and then bacteria, go to work on the sugary pulp. They break down the sugars and produce heat, and the temperature inside the pile can rise quite high. The acids produced by this process seep through the skin of the seed and into its heart, killing the tiny plant embryo inside and setting off a chain of changes that create the building blocks of chocolate flavor. This natural process of change, which takes about 5 to 7 days, is followed by drying, usually under the sun. The dried beans are then shipped to factories where they are roasted. Roasting is where the real flavors come alive. The heat triggers a reaction between sugars and other compounds inside the bean, the same reaction that gives toasted bread its golden crust and seared meat its rich aroma. Scientists have found roughly 600 different scent-producing compounds in roasted cacao, which is why chocolate has one of the most complex flavors of any food we eat. The 3 main families of cacao that matter to our story represent different paths through time and different balances of these flavors. The oldest cultivated type, refined by the Maya over thousands of years, produces a more delicate, more nuanced chocolate, but it is fragile, produces less fruit, and falls ill more easily. It makes up only about 5 to 10% of the world's cacao today. The hardier type, the workhorse of the global industry, gives a stronger, more bitter flavor and accounts for about 80% of all the cacao grown on Earth. And the hybrid born from a chance crossing of the two on the island of Trinidad in the 1700s sits somewhere between the two, combining something of the flavor of one with the toughness of the other. More recent studies of cacao genetics have revealed that the picture is even more varied than this neat 3-way division suggests. There are at least 10 distinct genetic groups within the species, each with its own flavor character and growing habits. This hidden diversity, concentrated in the Amazon basin but scattered across the tropics by thousands of years of human hands, represents a vast treasure of unexplored tastes and a vital resource for creating trees that can withstand the diseases and climate pressures of the future. The man who named the cacao tree food of the gods could not have known any of this. But his instinct was right. The chemistry of the cacao seed, shaped by millions of years of evolution and thousands of years of careful tending, produces flavors so rich and layered that no laboratory has yet managed to copy them. Every chocolate bar, every cup of cocoa, every truffle is the final note of a long, quiet symphony that begins in the genes of a tropical tree. And yet, for all its wonder, the story of cacao has a darker chapter. One that runs alongside the sweetness like a shadow, a story of the human hands that picked those pods and the terrible price they paid. On a small island in the Gulf of Guinea, barely visible on most maps, a system of labor so harsh that it shocked even the people of its own era was producing much of the chocolate that Europeans enjoyed with their afternoon tea. The island was a Portuguese territory off the western coast of Africa, and by the late 1870s, it was responsible for more than 20% of the world's cacao. The workers who made this possible were, on paper, not slaves. Portugal had officially ended slavery in its colonies in 1869, but the difference between the old slavery and the new system of contract labor was, as one British journalist put it, a distinction without a difference. The story of forced labor in cacao production begins long before that island. From the very first decades of Spanish rule in the Americas, the growing of cacao depended on the labor of people who had no choice. The colonial system that gave Spanish settlers the right to demand work from local communities was applied to cacao farming across Mesoamerica. The same people who had once cultivated cacao as a sacred crop for their own ceremonies were now forced to grow it for export to Spain. The death rate among these workers was catastrophic, driven by disease, exhaustion, and the destruction of their traditional ways of life. As local populations collapsed under the weight of European illnesses, the colonial authorities turned to enslaved Africans to fill the gap. In the fertile valleys of what is now Venezuela, which became one of the most important cacao-growing regions in the colonial world, large numbers of enslaved people from Africa were brought in during the 1700s to work the coastal plantation. Some of those plantations, including one famous estate that still produces some of the finest cacao in the world, were built entirely on the labor of enslaved people whose names have been largely lost to history. In Brazil, the cacao plantations of the Northeast and the Amazon relied on enslaved labor from the 1600s through the 1800s, creating wealth for a small class of landowners while condemning generations of workers to lives of brutal hardship. The formal end of slavery in the 19th century did not end forced labor in cacao production. It simply changed its shape. The Portuguese island colony in the Gulf of Guinea provides the most thoroughly documented case. After the official abolition of slavery, the plantation owners and colonial officials devised a system of contract labor that was, in everything but name, the same thing. Workers, mostly from the Portuguese territory of Angola on the African mainland, were pressured or tricked into signing 5-year contracts that promised wages and a trip home when the term was up. In practice, the promises were never kept. Workers who arrived on the island were not allowed to leave. Their wages were taken or held back, and the conditions on the cacao plantations were no different from what had come before. By the turn of the 20th century, roughly 4,000 workers a year were being sent to the island. None of them ever returned. The scandal burst into public view in 1901, when a member of one of England's most prominent chocolate families heard troubling rumors about conditions on the island while visiting the Caribbean. This man came from a family of Quakers who had built their fortune on chocolate and their reputation on principles of fairness and justice. He was particularly disturbed to learn that his own company was buying a large share of its cacao from the very place where these abuses were happening. His investigation turned up a chilling detail. A plantation for sale on the island had listed 200 workers among its assets, as if they were property rather than free people. He sent a fellow Quaker with no ties to the chocolate trade to the island to see conditions for himself. The investigator spent several years on the ground, and when his report was made public in 1908, it confirmed the worst fears. The contract labor system was slavery in all but name. The scandal deepened when a newspaper accused the chocolate company of slowness, indifference, and hypocrisy. The charge stung because the family had actively supported the movement against slavery. They had helped fund efforts to expose brutal labor practices in other parts of Africa. The idea that these same principled people were profiting from forced labor in their own supply chain was, for many observers, a painful contradiction. The company sued the newspaper, and the trial in 1909 became one of the most talked about legal cases in England. The jury found that the newspaper had indeed gone too far in its accusations, but the damages it awarded were almost insulting, the smallest coin in the country, worth a fraction of a penny. The message was clear. The company might have won the case, but the court of public opinion was not impressed by how long it had taken to act. Within months, the company announced it would no longer buy cacao from the island and shifted its purchases to the Gold Coast of West Africa, where conditions were believed to be better. The scandal left a lasting mark on the chocolate industry, establishing the idea that companies and consumers bore some responsibility for the conditions under which their raw materials were produced. But it did not end the exploitation. It simply moved it to new places and new forms. The connection between chocolate and forced labor is not a small footnote in the story of an otherwise innocent treat. It runs through the center of the narrative. The European appetite for chocolate, from the colonial era through the industrial age, was fed by the labor of people who had no choice and no voice. The sweetness of chocolate has always come with a human cost. And the challenge of separating the pleasure from the suffering remains, as we will see, one of the most uncomfortable questions in the modern food world. Let us turn now to a brighter chapter, to a small invention in a Dutch workshop that would change the course of chocolate history forever. In a workshop in Amsterdam in the year 1828, a Dutch chemist completed work on an invention that would do more to change the nature of chocolate than anything since the ancient Maya first learned to froth cacao in a ceramic cup. His name was Coenraad Johannes van Houten, and he had been wrestling with a stubborn problem. The cacao bean, once roasted and ground, produces a thick, oily paste that is roughly half fat by weight. This high fat content made the resulting chocolate drink rich, but also heavy, greasy, and difficult to dissolve in water. For centuries, chocolate makers had struggled with this, adding starch or cornmeal to try to make the drink lighter and more manageable. Van Houten's solution was beautifully simple. He built a powerful press that physically squeezed most of the fat out of the roasted cacao paste. What remained was a dry, crumbly cake that could be ground into a fine powder. This powder dissolved easily in water or milk, producing a lighter, smoother, more consistent drink than anyone had ever managed before. But Van Houten was not finished. He also developed a second process, treating the powder with a mild substance that took the edge off cacao's natural sharpness. This treatment, which came to be known as the Dutch method, produced a darker, mellower cocoa that blended more easily with liquids. Cocoa made this way is still sold today, and if you have ever baked with a dark, smooth cocoa powder, you have likely used something that traces its origins directly to this Dutch workshop. The importance of Van Houten's press went far beyond making a better cup of cocoa. The machine had split a single raw material into two separate products, cocoa powder on one hand and the fat it had squeezed out on the other. That fat, golden and smooth, had a remarkable quality. It melted at almost exactly the temperature of the human body. This meant it was solid at room temperature but dissolved the instant it touched your tongue, creating an intensely pleasant sensation that is almost impossible to describe without the word luxurious. For centuries, this fat had been an unavoidable part of the thick, heavy cacao paste. Now, for the first time, it was available on its own, and chocolate makers quickly realized that they could add this extracted fat back into ground cacao in carefully controlled amounts, producing a mixture that was smoother, more moldable, and far more versatile than anything that had come before. They could shape it, pour it, and let it harden into forms that held together at room temperature but melted beautifully in the mouth. In other words, Van Houten's press did not directly create the chocolate bar, but it made the chocolate bar possible. Van Houten was born in 1801, the son of a man who had started a chocolate factory in Amsterdam in 1815. The father had already been experimenting with ways to improve how chocolate was made, and the son inherited both the business and the obsession. The invention of the press was not a flash of sudden inspiration. It was the result of years of patient, systematic work. He patented his press in 1828, but the patent was limited in scope and did not last long. Competitors quickly adopted and improved on his methods. Within a few decades, the technique had spread to chocolate makers all across Europe, and the industry was fundamentally changed. No single company could hold a monopoly on the idea, because the technology was relatively straightforward and the patent soon expired. The effect on the economics of chocolate was just as important as the effect on the taste. Before 1828, chocolate was an expensive luxury made in small batches by skilled craftsmen and enjoyed mostly by the wealthy. The press made it possible to produce affordable cocoa powder in large quantities, dramatically bringing down the price. The combination of the press and the Dutch treatment has been called the moment when chocolate was made available to the common person, when a drink that had been reserved for the privileged few for 3 centuries began its transformation into something everyone could afford. The timing was significant too. The 1820s marked the early years of the industrial age in northwestern Europe. The new chocolate technology fit perfectly into the emerging model of factory production. Steam-powered mills could process cacao beans in quantities that would have been unthinkable to the monastery kitchens of the previous century. And the separation of cocoa fat opened up entirely new possibilities that inventors would explore over the coming decades. Van Houten himself did not become fabulously wealthy from his invention, though the family business prospered. He lived until 1887, long enough to see the full impact of his press on the world. The brand bearing his name continued for many years and became one of the most recognized names in cocoa powder around the globe. The true legacy of this quiet Dutch chemist lies not in any single product, but in the transformation he set in motion. Before his press, chocolate was a drink, thick and expensive and reserved for the few. After his press, chocolate was on its way to becoming everything it is today: a powder, a bar, a candy, a coating, an ingredient, an industry. Within 20 years, an English company would create the first solid chocolate bar. Within 50 years, a Swiss maker would invent milk chocolate. Within 70 years, another Swiss inventor would stumble upon the art of conching. Each of these breakthroughs built directly on what Van Houten had made possible, and each would have been unthinkable without the simple but brilliant act of squeezing the fat from a cacao bean. Let us now meet those English chocolate makers, a group of families bound together by faith, conscience, and a shared belief that chocolate could change the world. In the spring of 1761, a Quaker pharmacist walked into an auction house in the English city of Bristol and bought a chocolate-making business. His name was Joseph Fry. He was not a chocolatier by training. He was an apothecary who sold cocoa from his shop, and he saw a chance to control the whole process from bean to cup. Within a few years, his agents were selling chocolate in over 50 towns across England. He could not have known it, but he had just laid the foundation for a family business that would help shape British chocolate for the next 2 centuries. And he was not the only Quaker who would do so. The connection between the Quaker faith and chocolate is one of the most striking patterns in the history of food. 3 of Britain's greatest chocolate companies, the Fry business in Bristol, the Cadbury business in Birmingham, and the Rowntree business in York, were all founded by Quaker families. This was not a coincidence. In the England of the 18th and 19th centuries, members of the Quaker faith were barred from attending the great universities, shut out of most professions, and forbidden from holding public office. Pushed away from the usual paths of advancement, they turned to commerce and industry, and they brought with them a distinctive set of values: honesty, fair dealing, simplicity, social responsibility, and a deep opposition to alcohol. That opposition to drink was especially important for chocolate. Quakers saw alcohol as a root cause of poverty and suffering. Cocoa and chocolate offered a wholesome alternative, a warm, nourishing, pleasurable drink that could be enjoyed without sin or social harm. For a Quaker businessman, selling chocolate was not just a way to make money. It was a kind of moral mission, giving working people a healthier choice than gin and beer. Joseph Fry's grandson, also named Joseph, made the breakthrough that would transform the family business from a maker of drinking chocolate into a manufacturer of something entirely new. In 1847, working in the family factory in Bristol, the younger Fry discovered that by mixing melted cocoa fat back into a blend of cocoa powder and sugar, he could create a paste smooth enough to press into a mold. When the mixture cooled, it hardened into a solid bar that could be held in the hand and eaten as a treat rather than dissolved into a drink. This was the first modern chocolate bar. For over 3,000 years, cacao had been a liquid, something to sip from cups and vessels. Fry's creation turned it into something to unwrap and bite. The Cadbury story begins with a young Quaker named John Cadbury who opened a shop in Birmingham in 1824, selling tea, coffee, and drinking chocolate. His decision to sell these drinks grew from the same belief in temperance that motivated the Frys. But it was his 2 sons, George and Richard, who would turn the modest family business into an empire. They took over in 1861, inheriting a company that was struggling and nearly bankrupt. The brothers were still in their early 20s and the challenge was daunting. Their turning point came when they adopted a new cocoa press based on the Dutch design we heard about in the last section. It produced a purer cocoa powder without the starches and thickeners that other companies routinely added. They sold it under a bold promise, and the claim struck a chord with a public that was increasingly worried about what went into their food. Sales recovered and then surged, but the Cadbury brothers' most lasting achievement was not a product. It was a place. In 1879, they moved the factory out of its cramped city location to open land south of Birmingham. They called it Bournville, and over the following decades, George Cadbury in particular turned it into something the world had never quite seen before, a model village designed from the ground up for the well-being of the workers. He bought land around the factory and built hundreds of homes, each with its own garden, set along tree-lined streets with generous parks and sports fields. There were swimming facilities and changing rooms. A medical department served thousands of workers. Sick pay was set at a level that allowed people to recover without fear of ruin. Alcohol was not allowed in the village in keeping with Quaker principles, but the real point was broader than temperance. George Cadbury believed that if you gave working people light, space, fresh air, and a decent home, they would become healthier, happier, and more productive. In 1900, he established a trust to ensure that the model village would survive beyond his own lifetime. It still stands today. The third great Quaker chocolate family was the Rowntrees of York. Joseph Rowntree joined his brother's cocoa business in 1869 and brought with him both a sharp commercial mind and a deep concern for social justice. His son would become one of the most important researchers of poverty in British history. In 1899, the younger Rowntree undertook a study that would change the way his country thought about the poor. He sent investigators to visit every working-class household in the city of York, surveying thousands of families. The results shattered the comfortable assumption that poverty was mostly the fault of the poor themselves. The data showed plainly that the chief cause of poverty was not laziness or drinking, but wages too low to keep a family alive. These findings helped change the direction of British public life. They contributed to the welfare reforms that laid the foundations of the modern social safety net. It is a striking thing, when you think about it, that a family which made its fortune selling chocolate played such a direct role in reshaping how a nation cared for its most vulnerable people. The Quaker chocolate empires did not survive the 20th century intact. Fry's merged with Cadbury. Rowntree was bought by a Swiss company. And in 2010, Cadbury itself, the last of the great Quaker firms to remain independent, was taken over by an American food corporation in a deal that left many in Britain feeling that something precious had been lost. The Bournville factory still operates. The model village still stands. But the Quaker values that built them now belong to history. What remains is the idea, and it is a powerful one. The idea that a business can be both profitable and humane. That making chocolate and making the world a better place are not opposing ambitions, but two sides of the same coin. And while these English Quakers were building their chocolate utopias across the water in Switzerland, a handful of inventors were about to make the chocolate bar smoother, creamier, and more irresistible than anyone had thought possible. In a small lakeside town on the northern shore of Lake Geneva, a young candle maker named Daniel Peter spent the better part of a decade wrestling with a problem that had defeated every chocolatier who had tried it before him. The idea seemed simple enough. If you could combine chocolate with milk, you would soften its intense bitterness and create something creamier, gentler, more appealing to a wider range of people. But the chemistry refused to cooperate. Fresh milk was mostly water, and water did not mix with cocoa fat. Every time Peter tried to blend liquid milk into melted chocolate, the result was a grainy, unstable mess that spoiled quickly. He tried different proportions, different temperatures, different techniques. Nothing worked. The water in the milk simply would not go away. As it happened, Peter's neighbor was a German-born chemist and businessman who had recently invented something rather useful, a method for removing most of the water from milk while keeping its nutritional value. The product was condensed milk, thick and sweet and stable on the shelf. It had been developed mainly as a food for babies whose mothers could not nurse, but it would turn out to have a use that no one had imagined. Peter realized that condensed milk, with its greatly reduced water content, might be the answer to his long struggle. By using this concentrated milk instead of the fresh kind, he could bring in the flavor and creaminess of dairy without the troublesome water. The breakthrough came in 1875. Peter created a stable, moldable chocolate that contained milk, and the result was unlike anything the world had tasted. Where dark chocolate was intense and bitter and grown up, milk chocolate was smooth and sweet and immediately welcoming. It pleased children and adults alike. Peter showed his creation at an exposition in Paris in 1878, where it won a medal and drew attention from across the continent. The age of milk chocolate had begun, but milk chocolate was only half of the Swiss Revolution. The other half came from a different workshop in a different city, and the story of how it happened has become one of the most charming legends in the history of food. In the city of Bern, a young chocolate maker named Rodolphe Lind was running a small factory in the late 1870s. Like everyone else in the trade, he was frustrated by the texture of the chocolate available at the time. Even after the Dutch innovations with the cocoa press, chocolate remained somewhat coarse and gritty. Lind believed that something smoother was possible, but he had not yet figured out how to achieve it. The story that has been passed down goes like this. One Friday evening in 1879, Lind left his factory without turning off one of his mixing machines. The machine ran on its own all through the weekend, churning a batch of chocolate for roughly 72 hours. When Lind came back on Monday morning, he expected to find the batch ruined. Instead, he found something extraordinary. The chocolate had been transformed. It was dark and glossy, with a sheen like silk. When he tasted it, the texture was like nothing he or anyone else had ever produced. It was smooth beyond belief, and it seemed to melt on the tongue without any effort at all. The bitterness that marked even the finest dark chocolate had mellowed and softened, worked out of the mixture by the long, continuous stirring. Whether the weekend story is exactly true or a bit of romantic embellishment, the result was real. Lind had discovered a process that would come to be called conching, named after the shell-shaped container in which the chocolate was stirred. During conching, the chocolate was continuously mixed, folded, and exposed to air for long periods, sometimes as much as 3 days. This prolonged action did several important things at once. It broke down the solid particles in the chocolate to a size so small that the tongue could no longer detect them, creating a feeling of perfect smoothness. It allowed harsh, sharp-tasting compounds left over from the earlier stages of processing to evaporate away. It spread the cocoa fat evenly through the mixture, coating every tiny particle in a thin film of richness. And it allowed new, more complex flavors to develop, giving the finished chocolate a depth and warmth that shorter mixing could never achieve. Lind's chocolate was a sensation in its day. Its texture was so far beyond anything else on the market that it created an entirely new class of premium chocolate. Other Swiss makers rushed to understand and copy the process. In 1899, Lind sold his factory and the rights to his method for a very large sum, and the company that resulted from that sale remains one of the most respected chocolate brands in the world today. Switzerland's rise to the top of the chocolate world is remarkable when you consider the country's geography. Switzerland grows no cacao. It had no tropical colonies, no access to the raw materials, and no historical connection to the regions where cacao was native. What it had was a tradition of precision craftsmanship, excellent dairy farms, a culture that prized quality over quantity, and a handful of innovators who happened to live in the same small country during the same extraordinary decades. The Swiss chocolate story includes other names as well. One maker opened his factory in the 1820s and built a brand that, with its purple wrapping and images of alpine meadows, became one of the most recognized in all of Europe. Another created a distinctive triangular bar in 1908, made of milk chocolate, nougat, almonds, and honey, inspired by the jagged profile of a famous Swiss mountain. Together, the Swiss innovations of the 1870s and 1880s, milk chocolate and conching, combined with the Dutch cocoa press and the English chocolate bar, formed the complete set of techniques behind modern chocolate. Within a span of about 50 years, from 1828 to 1879, every step needed to turn a bitter cacao bean into a smooth, sweet, solid bar had been invented. Every chocolate bar eaten anywhere in the world today owes its existence to this small group of inventors, mostly Swiss, Dutch, and English, who reimagined what chocolate could be. And across the Atlantic, a man who had failed at the candy business not once but twice was about to take these European ideas and turn them into something uniquely, unmistakably American. On a warm day in the summer of 1893, a 35-year-old candy maker from rural Pennsylvania walked through the doors of the Great World's Fair in Chicago and into a building that would change his life. Milton Hershey had come to Chicago as a successful but restless businessman. He owned a thriving caramel company, but caramels did not excite him. What he saw inside the machinery hall did. A German company was demonstrating chocolate-making equipment, machines that roasted cacao beans, ground them into paste, mixed them with sugar and milk, and produced chocolate on an industrial scale. Hershey watched the demonstration with the intensity of a man who had just found his purpose. Before he left Chicago, he had bought the entire set of machinery and arranged to have it shipped home. His path to that moment had been anything but smooth. He was born in 1857 on a small farm in central Pennsylvania, the son of a restless dreamer who drifted from one failed venture to the next, and a steady, practical mother who held the family together. His formal schooling ended after the 4th grade. At 14, he was sent to learn the candy-making trade. At 18, he struck out on his own, opening a candy shop in Philadelphia. It failed. He tried again in Denver, then Chicago, then New York, starting and closing businesses in each city. Each failure left him deeper in debt and more determined. Finally, back in Pennsylvania, he started a caramel company using a recipe that incorporated fresh milk, and this time the business succeeded. But after that day at the Chicago Fair, his attention shifted entirely from caramels to chocolate. He installed the German machinery in a corner of his factory and spent months experimenting, trying to develop a recipe for milk chocolate that could be made on a large scale and sold at a price any American could afford. The European version, particularly the Swiss, was beautiful but expensive, imported in small amounts and treated as a luxury. Hershey wanted something different. He wanted chocolate for everyone. The recipe he eventually developed was distinctly American. It had a tangy, slightly sour quality that European chocolatiers found odd, even unpleasant. The flavor came from the way the milk was prepared before being combined with the chocolate. A process caused certain compounds in the milk to break down partially, producing a sharpness that was unfamiliar to European palates but that American consumers came to love. That distinctive tang became the baseline of American chocolate, the flavor that generations of Americans would grow up with and think of whenever they heard the word chocolate. In 1900, Hershey made a bold decision. He sold his caramel company for $1 million, an enormous sum at the time, and poured all of it into building the largest chocolate factory in the world. For the site, he chose the rolling farmland of his childhood, the same area of central Pennsylvania where he had been born. The choice was deliberate. The dairy farms surrounding the site would provide an endless supply of fresh milk, and the open countryside offered room to grow that no city could match. But Hershey was building more than a factory. He was building a town. Inspired by the model communities he had seen in Europe, including the Cadbury family's Bournville, he laid out streets, built homes for his workers, installed a trolley line, and established schools, churches, parks, and playing fields. The main crossroads of the town featured two streets named for his product. The street lamps were shaped like his most famous candy, and the air itself smelled of chocolate, a warm, cocoa-scented haze that hung over the town and became its most distinctive and beloved quality. Hershey's personal life carried both great love and great sadness. He married in 1898, and the couple adored children but were unable to have any of their own. This private grief became the seed of one of the most remarkable acts of generosity in American history. In 1909, Milton and his wife founded a school for orphaned boys, giving them a home, an education, and a chance at a life they might never have had. After his wife's death in 1915, Hershey threw himself into the school with even greater devotion. In 1918, he quietly transferred his entire fortune, including his controlling share in the chocolate company, into a trust for the school. The gift was kept secret for years. When a journalist discovered it in 1923, Hershey was embarrassed by the attention. The school grew into one of the wealthiest private schools in the country. By the early 21st century, the trust's assets had grown to roughly $15 billion, and the school served about 2,000 students, spending generously on each one. As a businessman, Hershey was equally distinctive. He understood, earlier than most, the power of a consistent product. His chocolate bar, in its familiar brown and silver wrapper, tasted exactly the same whether you bought it in Pennsylvania or California. This consistency was a quiet revolution at a time when most sweets varied wildly from batch to batch. He also made the unusual decision not to advertise. For decades, the company spent almost nothing on marketing, relying instead on the product's low price, its presence in every corner shop and train station, and the simple force of word of mouth. It was not until 1970, under pressure from competitors, that the company finally began running advertisements. The price of a Hershey bar held steady at 5 cents from 1900 until 1969. The size of the bar changed over the years, shrinking when costs rose and growing when they fell, but the price stayed the same for nearly 7 decades. This made chocolate a genuinely everyday pleasure in America, something a child could buy with pocket change, something a worker could slip into a lunch pail, something a soldier could carry overseas. Milton Hershey died in 1945 at the age of 88. He had lived to see his company become the largest chocolate maker in America, his town become a real community, and his school educate thousands of young people who might otherwise have had no opportunity. The town still stands. The factory still operates. The air still carries a faint smell of chocolate on certain days, and the streetlights shaped like his most famous candy still line the road he named for the thing he loved most. And now, chocolate was about to travel to places no candy bar had ever been, carried not by merchants or monks, but by soldiers marching into the most devastating wars the world had ever known. In 1937, a United States Army officer walked into the offices of a chocolate company in Pennsylvania with an unusual request. He wanted a chocolate bar that met 4 very specific requirements. It had to weigh 4 ounces. It had to provide 600 calories of energy. It had to survive temperatures hot enough to melt ordinary chocolate. And, most strangely of all, it had to taste, in the officer's own words, just a little better than a boiled potato. That last requirement was not a joke. The Army wanted an emergency ration, a dense block of calories a soldier could carry in his pack for the worst moments. But they did not want it to taste good enough that soldiers would eat it as a snack, using up their emergency supply before any emergency arrived. The company's chemists got to work. The bar they developed was hard, dark brown and made from chocolate, sugar, oatmeal, cocoa fat, dried milk, and a scattering of vitamins. It was so tough it could barely be bitten. Soldiers were told to shave off pieces with a knife and let them dissolve slowly in the mouth. The taste was deliberately unappealing, bitter and gritty with a chalky finish. By the middle of the year, the factory was producing 90,000 of these bars for the military, each one pressed into its mold by hand. But the relationship between chocolate and soldiers goes back much further than that. In the early 1800s, French troops carried chocolate as part of their rations, valued for its concentrated energy during long marches. The tradition continued throughout the 19th century as European armies came to understand that chocolate, with its mix of fat, sugar, and natural stimulants, was a remarkably efficient way to keep men on their feet. During a war in the 1850s, British soldiers received chocolate along with their standard provisions. And at the turn of the 20th century, the Queen of England personally arranged for decorated chocolate tins to be sent to her soldiers serving in a distant campaign. Each tin carried her portrait and a personal message, turning a simple ration into a royal gesture of thanks. The First World War made chocolate a standard part of military life on every side. British, French, German, American, and Canadian troops all received it with their regular provisions. The enormous demand pushed factories to shift from making sweets for shops to filling military orders at a scale never seen before. For soldiers trapped in the horror of the trenches, a piece of chocolate offered a moment of comfort, a small sweetness in a world of mud, cold, and fear. Letters sent home from the front mentioned chocolate again and again as one of the few small pleasures still available, and chocolate became a regular item in the care packages that families sent to their loved ones overseas. But it was the Second World War that turned chocolate into a strategic resource. That unappealing emergency bar, despised by nearly every soldier who ate it, was produced in breathtaking quantities. By the war's end, a single factory in a small Pennsylvania town had made more than 3 billion of them. Soldiers gave the bar several unflattering nicknames. Many simply threw theirs away, preferring hunger to the experience of eating one. Recognizing the problem, the company developed a slightly improved version that was somewhat smoother and less gritty, though still far from enjoyable. It became a standard part of the field ration that sustained American soldiers through campaigns across 3 continents. Now, the most touching chapter in the wartime chocolate story was written not in a factory, but in the sky. In the summer of 1948, one of the great cities of Europe was cut off from the world. All roads, railways, and waterways leading into the western half of the divided city had been blocked. The Western countries responded with a massive effort to supply the city by air, flying in food and fuel around the clock. Among the pilots flying those endless supply missions was a young American who noticed children gathering along the fence of the airfield to watch the planes come in. On impulse, he promised the children that he would drop candy from his plane the next day. He told them to watch for the aircraft that wiggled its wings. The following day, he tied small packages of chocolate and chewing gum to tiny parachutes made from handkerchiefs and dropped them from his plane as he made his approach. The children went wild with joy. Word spread, and soon hundreds of children were gathering along the flight path. Other pilots joined in. What had started as one man's spontaneous act of kindness grew into an organized campaign that captured the imagination of an entire nation. School children across America made tiny parachutes and collected candy for the effort. Chocolate companies donated tons of their product. By the time the crisis ended, more than 23 tons of candy had been dropped on more than 250,000 miniature parachutes. The pilot became known as the Candy Bomber. For the children of that city who had spent years under bombardment and deprivation, a chocolate bar drifting down from the sky on a tiny parachute was more than a treat. It was a message, a sign that someone somewhere far away knew they were there and cared about them. The broader picture of American soldiers handing out chocolate to children across liberated Europe created associations that lasted for generations. In France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, the image of the smiling soldier offering a chocolate bar to a wide-eyed child became one of the most enduring images of the war's aftermath. For millions of people who had endured years of occupation and hunger, American chocolate was a luxury, a curiosity, and a symbol of freedom, all wrapped in the same brown and silver paper. Chocolate's connection to the military did not end there. It continued through later conflicts and remains part of modern military rations to this day. The thread stretches all the way back to those Aztec warriors who drank their bitter cacao before marching into battle, a connection spanning centuries and continents, linking the ancient world to the modern one through a single, improbable substance. And now our story turns to a different kind of transformation, the story of how cacao traveled to a continent where it had never grown before and changed the lives of millions of people in the process. Sometime around 1870, a blacksmith from the coast of what was then called the Gold Coast in West Africa boarded a ship bound for a small island in the Gulf of Guinea. His name was Tete Quashi, and he had gone to the island to work. What he found there, among the cacao plantations that European colonizers had established, were the trees that would transform his homeland. In 1876, Quashi returned home carrying cacao pods, the precious seeds of the cacao tree. He planted them on his farm in a town in the eastern region. He chose a hardy variety well suited to the local climate and soil. By 1879, his trees were bearing fruit. Quashi died on Christmas Day, 1892, having lived just long enough to see the very beginning of what his planting would set in motion. The following year, the Gold Coast made its first official export of cocoa, just 2 bags. The amount was tiny, but the start was momentous. Within 2 decades, exports had grown to thousands of tons a year. Between 1910 and 1980, the country, which had gained its independence and taken the name Ghana in 1957, was the world's largest cocoa exporter. A single man carrying a handful of pods across a stretch of sea had set off one of the greatest agricultural transformations in the history of a continent. Whether Quashi was the absolute first to bring cacao to the Gold Coast is a matter of some debate. A colonial governor's family also claimed credit for introducing the crop, but the question was investigated and the verdict came down in Quashi's favor. What is not in dispute is that he was the most influential figure in the story, the man whose planting and encouragement inspired a wave of small-scale farmers to take up the crop. The way cacao farming spread across West Africa was different from the plantation model that had dominated production in Latin America and the Caribbean. In the Gold Coast and later in the neighboring territory that would become the country of Ivory Coast, cacao was grown mainly by small farmers on plots of just a few hectares rather than on the large estates common elsewhere. This was partly because of how land was owned and shared in the region, partly because of colonial policy, and partly because of the initiative of the farmers themselves, who recognized the opportunity and seized it on their own terms. The colonial government encouraged cacao as a crop for export, setting up nurseries and programs to distribute seedlings. But the real engine of growth was the entrepreneurship of African farmers. Families from the southern regions moved into forested areas, cleared patches of land, and planted cacao alongside their food crops. The farming frontier pushed steadily northward and westward, following the retreating edge of the tropical forest. By the 1920s, the Gold Coast was producing more cacao than any other country on Earth, and cocoa had overtaken gold and timber as the colony's most valuable export. The story in the neighboring French colony followed a similar path, though the timing was different. Cacao had been introduced there in the late 1800s, but did not achieve large-scale production until the middle of the 20th century. After independence in 1960, the new government threw its weight behind cacao as the foundation of the national economy. The country's first leader was himself a wealthy cocoa farmer, and his policies, including guaranteed prices for farmers and investment in rural roads and services, drove an enormous expansion. By the 1980s, this country had overtaken Ghana as the world's largest cacao producer, a position it still holds today. The scale of West Africa's dominance in the global cacao supply is difficult to overstate. The two leading countries together produce roughly 60 to 70% of the world's cacao. Add in their neighbors, Cameroon, Nigeria, and other West African producers, and the continent accounts for about 3/4 of the global total. This represents a remarkable geographic shift. Cacao, a tree that evolved in the Amazon and was first cultivated by the peoples of Mesoamerica, now has its productive heart in a part of the world where it was entirely unknown before the colonial era. But the rewards of this transformation have been shared with devastating inequality. The global chocolate industry generates well over $100 billion in revenue each year, yet the average cacao farmer in West Africa earns less than $2 a day, far below the poverty line. A typical farmer receives only about 6 or 7% of the final price of a chocolate bar. The rest is absorbed by the long chain of middlemen, processors, manufacturers, and retailers that stretches from rural Africa to the shops of Europe and North America. The causes of this poverty run deep. Cacao trees take 3 to 5 years to begin producing pods, and farmers must invest years of work before seeing any return. The trees are vulnerable to a range of diseases that can wipe out a harvest. Farmers typically have no insurance, no control over the prices set by distant commodity markets, and limited access to credit or training. Many have never tasted a finished chocolate bar and have no idea what the beans they spend their lives growing eventually become. The human cost extends beyond poverty. The clearing of forest to plant cacao has been catastrophic, with one country losing nearly 90% of its rainforest since independence, much of it to make way for cacao farms. Even national parks and protected forests have not been spared. And there is another cost, one that the world would only begin to confront at the turn of the 21st century, when journalists and investigators started looking more closely at who exactly was doing the hard, dangerous work of harvesting cacao in West Africa. In the year 2000, a British journalist traveled to the cacao-growing regions of West Africa and produced a report that shocked the world. His footage showed children as young as 12 working on cacao farms under conditions that met every reasonable definition of slavery. The children had been brought from neighboring countries, lured by promises of paid work and a better life. Instead, they found themselves trapped on isolated farms, forced to work from dawn to dusk harvesting cacao pods with large bladed tools, carrying heavy loads on their backs, and handling toxic chemicals with no protection. They were not paid. They were not allowed to leave. Many had not seen their families in years. The report, followed by a wave of investigative journalism, set off an international scandal. The revelations were especially damaging because they struck at the heart of one of the world's most loved consumer products. Every chocolate bar, every cup of cocoa, every chocolate treat sold in the shops of Europe and North America was potentially connected to child slavery. The chocolate industry, which had spent decades building an image of wholesome pleasure and family fun, suddenly found itself linked to some of the most extreme forms of labor exploitation on the planet. The political response came quickly but proved in the end to be inadequate. In September of 2001, a voluntary agreement was brokered between the major chocolate companies and the government. The heads of the largest chocolate firms signed a pledge to work toward ending the worst forms of child labor in cacao farming in West Africa. The agreement set a deadline of 2005 for the development of industry-wide standards and a system to certify that cocoa was being produced without child labor. The deadline came and went. The targets were not met. The deadline was pushed back to 2008, then 2010, then 2015, each time with goals that had been quietly made less ambitious. The 2015 target called for a 70% reduction in child labor on cacao farms. It was not achieved either. The deadline moved again to 2020, which also passed without success. A quarter century after the original scandal, the problem remains largely unsolved. The numbers tell a grim story. A study commissioned by the government found that over 2 million children were working in the cocoa sectors of the two main producing countries during one recent survey period. More recent estimates suggest that roughly 1.5 million children in those same two countries are engaged in work that is dangerous to their health and development. A detailed analysis found that 95% of children working on cacao farms were doing hazardous work, including using sharp tools, carrying heavy loads, being exposed to harmful chemicals, and working very long hours. The roots of the problem are inseparable from the economics of cacao farming. Farmers who earn less than $2 a day cannot afford to hire adult workers at a fair wage. The labor of family members, including children, is often the only way a small farmer can keep the operation running. In some cases, children work on their own family's farm, doing tasks that might be considered ordinary chores in other farming communities. In other cases, children are brought from distant places, handed over to farmers who treat them as unpaid laborers. The line between family work, child labor, and outright slavery is real but often blurry on the ground, making the problem extremely difficult to measure and even harder to solve. The chocolate industry has responded with a mix of social responsibility programs and certification systems. Companies have funded schools, distributed better seedlings, and organized training for farmers. Third-party certification programs offer consumers the promise that their chocolate was produced under improved conditions. But critics have pointed out that these programs cover only a fraction of the total cacao supply, and that even certified farms are not immune to problems. The fundamental issue is one of price. The international price of cacao is set by commodity markets far from the farms where it grows, and it moves up and down based on supply, demand, currency shifts, and the bets of traders. Farmers have no influence over these prices and no power to negotiate a larger share of the value. The result is a system in which the people who grow the raw material for an industry worth well over $100 billion live in poverty, while the companies that process and sell the finished products capture the vast majority of the profits. A respected report published by a group of civil society organizations put the matter bluntly, surveying the entire chocolate industry. The report concluded that not a single company or government was anywhere close to eliminating child labor in the cacao sector. The report noted that while spending on sustainability programs had increased, the programs were not designed to address the root cause, which was simply and painfully the poverty of the farmers. The moral weight of all this is considerable. Chocolate is eaten mainly in wealthy countries by people who are, for the most part, entirely unaware of the conditions under which it was produced. The chain that connects a cacao farmer in rural West Africa to a consumer buying a chocolate bar in London or New York passes through so many hands: cooperatives, traders, processors, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers, that the human stories at the beginning of the chain have disappeared completely by the time the product reaches the shelf. There is a painful echo here of a scandal we encountered earlier in our story. More than a century ago, the exposure of forced labor on cacao plantations in a small island colony forced the British chocolate industry to confront the human cost of its raw materials. 100 years later, the same industry found itself facing the same question. The parallels suggest that the relationship between chocolate and exploited labor is not an accident of history, but something woven into the very structure of the trade, a pattern that has persisted across centuries and continents. Let us turn now to something quieter, and in its own way, rather wonderful, the story of what actually happens inside a cacao bean as it transforms from a bitter seed into something the world cannot get enough of. Here is something worth knowing about chocolate. The flavor you love, the deep, rich, complex taste that makes chocolate unlike anything else in the world does not exist in nature. A raw cacao seed, straight from the pod, contains not a single one of the compounds that give chocolate its smell or taste. It is bitter, chalky, and thoroughly unpleasant. Chocolate flavor is not found. It is made, built step by step through a chain of changes so delicate and complicated that scientists have spent more than a century trying to understand them and still do not have the full picture. The transformation begins the instant a cacao pod is split open. The seeds, still wrapped in their sweet, slippery white pulp, are exposed to the air, and within hours, tiny organisms from the environment begin their work. Yeasts colonize the sugary pulp first, feasting on its sugars and turning them into alcohol. This is the same basic process that gives us wine and beer, and it lasts about a day or two. Then a different group of organisms takes over, converting the alcohol into a sharp acid, the same kind that gives vinegar its bite. This second phase produces a great deal of heat. The temperature inside the pile of fermenting beans can climb quite high, reaching levels that would be uncomfortable to touch. This heat and acid do something crucial. They seep through the skin of each seed and reach the tiny plant embryo inside, killing it. And the death of that embryo is, strangely, the moment when everything begins. With the embryo gone, a cascade of natural reactions is set off within the seed. Proteins are broken apart into their building blocks. Sugars are released from larger molecules. These fragments, these building blocks of protein and sugar, are the essential raw materials from which chocolate flavor will eventually be built. Without fermentation, they do not form in sufficient quantities, and no amount of careful processing afterward can produce a true chocolate taste. This is why unfermented cacao, no matter how skillfully handled, never tastes like chocolate. The fermentation process takes about 5 to 7 days and is traditionally managed by the farmers themselves. They heap the wet beans on large leaves or place them in wooden boxes, turning them from time to time to keep the process even. The length of fermentation and the conditions under which it happens vary from region to region and from farm to farm, and these differences contribute greatly to the range of flavors you find in finished chocolate. Too short a fermentation and the beans will be underdeveloped. Too long and unwanted flavors creep in. The farmer's skill in managing this process is one of the most underappreciated elements in the making of fine chocolate. After fermentation, the beans are spread out to dry, usually under the sun. Drying brings the moisture down from a very high level to just a few percent, stopping the activity of the tiny organisms and allowing further quiet chemical changes to take place inside the seed. The dried beans are then shipped to factories, where the next and perhaps most dramatic step takes place: roasting. Roasting is where the real magic happens. When the beans are heated, the fragments of protein and sugar that fermentation created begin to react with each other. This is the same reaction that gives toasted bread its golden color and roasted meat its rich aroma, a reaction between sugars and the building blocks of protein that produces an enormous array of new flavor compounds. In roasted cacao, scientists have identified roughly 600 different compounds that contribute to what we perceive as chocolate aroma. This makes chocolate one of the most chemically complex flavors in the entire human diet, rivaling and perhaps exceeding the complexity of wine, coffee, or whiskey. The specific mix of these compounds and the balance between them determines the flavor of the finished chocolate. Different types of cacao produce different combinations. Different fermentation methods shift the balance. Different roasting times and temperatures change the emphasis. This is why chocolate from one country tastes different from chocolate grown in another, and why a lightly roasted bar has a different character from a deeply roasted one. Among the most important of these flavor compounds are a family that contributes nutty, toasted, and earthy notes. These form through a particular pathway during roasting and increase in concentration the longer the beans are heated. This is why more heavily roasted chocolate tends to have a deeper, more toasted character. At the same time, sugars in the bean undergo their own set of changes, producing compounds that add sweet, caramel, and butterscotch qualities. The interplay between these two sets of reactions, shaped by everything that came before in fermentation and drying, gives each batch of chocolate its own unique voice. After roasting, the beans are cracked open and the shells are removed, leaving behind the inner pieces, which are then ground. The grinding generates so much friction that the natural fat inside the bean melts, and the result is a thick, flowing paste, dark and rich, that forms the foundation of all chocolate products. This paste can be pressed to separate the fat from the solids, just as Van Houten did nearly 2 centuries ago, or it can be combined with extra fat, sugar, and other ingredients to begin the journey toward an eating chocolate. The final step in building both flavor and texture is the long, slow process of stirring and folding that we heard about in the story of the Swiss inventor who left his machine running over a weekend. During this extended mixing, the solid particles in the chocolate are ground down to a size so small the tongue cannot detect them, creating the feeling of perfect smoothness. Harsh, sharp-tasting compounds left over from earlier stages drift off into the air. The fat is spread evenly through the mass, coating every tiny grain. And new, deeper flavors continue to develop. The whole journey from fermenting pulp to finished chocolate is one of the most complex food transformations that human beings have ever devised. Every bar of chocolate is the final note of a long, quiet chain of chemistry that begins in the genes of a tropical tree and unfolds through the patient work of farmers, the heat of a roasting oven, and the slow turning of a machine. And now, with the science behind us, let us turn to the people who took all of this knowledge, all of these techniques, and built empires of chocolate that stretch across the modern world. In the winter of 1911, a young man with legs damaged by childhood illness sat in a kitchen in the American Northwest, stirring a pot of candy on a coal stove. His mother, wanting to keep her son occupied, had taught him to make sweets, and in that simple act, she had unknowingly started something that would grow into one of the largest private companies on Earth. His name was Frank Mars, and like Milton Hershey before him, his first attempts at the candy business ended in failure. His second attempt also struggled. But in 1923, working alongside his estranged teenage son, he created a candy bar that would change everything. The story, as the son later told it, began at a soda fountain. Father and son were drinking milkshakes, and the boy suggested making a candy bar that tasted like one. The result was a bar of chocolate malt nougat, topped with caramel and coated in milk chocolate, named not for the galaxy but for the milkshakes that inspired it. The candy was an immediate hit, and within a few years Frank Mars had built a thriving business. But the relationship between father and son was stormy. In 1932, after a bitter argument, the father gave his son a sum of money and the rights to sell the family's products overseas, effectively sending him into exile from the American business. The son traveled to Britain, where he set up a factory west of London. There, he created his own version of the family bar and several other sweets that became British favorites. He also visited Swiss chocolate factories, studying European techniques with the sharp eye of a man who planned to use every lesson he learned. The son's most important invention came in 1940. He had noticed soldiers during a recent European conflict eating small chocolate pellets coated in a hard candy shell that kept them from melting in the heat. He saw the commercial potential immediately. A chocolate you could carry in your pocket and eat with clean fingers, even on a warm day. He partnered with the son of the president of the Hershey company to develop the product, and the two of them gave it a name based on their initials. The partnership was strategic because during wartime, chocolate was rationed, and the connection to the other company gave him access to a reliable chocolate supply. When the war ended and rationing was lifted, he bought out his partner and took full control. The candy became a standard part of military supplies and, through military distribution, found its way into the hands of soldiers and civilians around the world. The father died in 1934, and for 3 decades the son maneuvered to regain control of the family business. He finally succeeded in 1964, merging his international operations with the original company to create a global giant. Under his leadership, the company became one of the most profitable and most secretive businesses in the world. The family, which kept complete private ownership, refused almost all interview requests, avoided being photographed, and ran their empire behind a deliberate wall of silence that continues to this day. While this family was building its empire through invention and family drama, a Swiss company was growing through a different strategy entirely, the strategy of buying other companies. The condensed milk business that had helped Daniel Peter invent milk chocolate had merged with another dairy firm in the early 1900s, creating a major European food company. Over the following decades, it expanded into chocolate by acquiring brands across the continent. The most significant of these purchases came in 1988, when the Swiss company bought the beloved English firm founded by the Quaker Chocolatiers family. The deal cost over £2.5 billion, an enormous sum that reflected the value of a portfolio, including some of the most recognized chocolate brands in the world. The sale was fiercely resisted and caused an outcry in Britain, where the loss of the Quaker company to a foreign buyer felt like the end of something precious. The third great pillar of the modern chocolate world was the Hershey company itself, which had grown from that Pennsylvania factory into the largest chocolate maker in North America. Its dominance was built on consistency and scale, the same familiar bar in the same familiar wrapper, available in every corner store and every train station across the country. By the late 20th century, a handful of companies controlled most of the world's chocolate. But the real hidden powers of the industry were not the names consumers recognized. They were the processing companies that most people had never heard of. One Swiss-Belgian firm processed roughly a quarter of all the cocoa beans harvested on Earth. An American agricultural conglomerate ran one of the largest cocoa operations in the world. A Singapore-based commodity trader handled enormous volumes. These companies bought raw beans, turned them into the intermediate products that chocolate makers need, and sold those products to the brand name firms that put the finished bars on store shelves. They were the invisible backbone of the entire industry, connecting millions of small farmers in West Africa to the factories and boardrooms of Europe and North America. The result of all this consolidation is a paradox. The variety of chocolate products available to consumers has never been greater, but the number of companies controlling the supply chain has never been smaller. What this means for farmers, for the price of cocoa, and for the future of chocolate itself is a question the industry is only now beginning to face. And speaking of associations that have been built over time, there is perhaps no connection more deeply woven into modern culture than the one between chocolate and love. In a small Birmingham factory in 1861, a young man named Richard Cadbury was thinking about a business problem that would, quite by accident, change the way the world expresses romantic love. The Cadbury brothers had recently upgraded their cocoa processing equipment, and the new machinery was squeezing cocoa fat from roasted cacao more efficiently than ever before. This left them with a surplus of fat and a question: what to do with it? Richard's solution was to mix the extra fat with sugar and cocoa powder to create small individual eating chocolates. But chocolates needed packaging, and Richard, who had an eye for art, decided to design the boxes himself. The boxes he created were beautiful things. He decorated them with painted images of flowers, country scenes, and, most importantly, images of cupids and rosebuds, the visual language of romance in that era. Some of the boxes were shaped like hearts. The message was unmistakable. These chocolates were not just a sweet treat. They were a way of saying something to the person who received them. And the boxes were designed to last long after the chocolates were gone, meant to be kept and used to hold love letters, dried flowers, or small keepsakes. The empty box, in a way, was the real gift. Richard Cadbury never protected his heart-shaped box design with a legal claim. Other companies quickly borrowed the idea, and within a few decades, the link between chocolate and a certain February holiday was firmly established. By the early 20th century, heart-shaped boxes of chocolates had become the expected gift, a tradition so deeply rooted that it feels as though it has always existed, though it was in fact the invention of a single businessman less than 200 years ago. But the connection between chocolate and love reaches back much further than that Victorian factory. The Aztecs connected cacao with their goddess of beauty, fertility, and desire, and chocolate was served at wedding ceremonies as a symbol of the bond between husband and wife. When the Spanish brought chocolate to Europe, these associations traveled with it. In the courts of 17th century France, chocolate was openly regarded as something that stirred the passions. One famous royal mistress was said to drink it to heighten her feelings for the king. The belief that chocolate has the power to kindle romance has proven remarkably durable across the centuries. In the 20th century, researchers identified several natural compounds in chocolate that seem to offer an explanation. One compound found in cacao is the same substance that the brain produces during the early stages of being in love. Another is a building block for one of the brain's feel-good signals. A third binds to the same receivers in the brain as the active compounds in certain other well-known plants. The headlines wrote themselves, and the idea that chocolate was a kind of love potion gained a new, scientific-sounding authority. The truth, as careful researchers have pointed out, is less exciting. The amounts of these compounds in chocolate are far too small to have any measurable effect on the brain or the body. One of them is broken down in the stomach long before it could reach the brain. Another is present in quantities far below any meaningful threshold. The scientific evidence, in the end, does not support the claim that chocolate has any real power to make people fall in love. But the cultural power of the idea has never depended on laboratory proof. It has been kept alive by a self-reinforcing loop of tradition, marketing, and emotional habit. The chocolate industry has poured enormous resources into nurturing the romantic image of its products. That February holiday alone accounts for roughly $1 billion in chocolate sales in the United States each year. The heart-shaped box, the velvet ribbon, the gold foil, the whispered promise of luxury, all of it is carefully designed to stir feelings of romance and special occasion. The way chocolate is marketed has also shaped how men and women relate to it differently. In the Western tradition, chocolate typically flows from men to women as a courtship gift. Advertisements for chocolate aimed at women often carry overtones of indulgence, self-reward, and even a touch of guilty pleasure, a tone that is notably absent from the marketing of most other foods. In Japan, the relationship between chocolate and romance took a different and rather interesting turn. When the holiday was introduced there in the 1930s, through the efforts of the candy industry, it was women, not men, who were expected to give the chocolate. Japanese custom came to distinguish between several types. There is chocolate given to a person one truly loves, often handmade to show sincerity. There is obligation chocolate, given to male co-workers and acquaintances as a social courtesy. And there is friend chocolate, exchanged among women as a gesture of affection. The social pressure to participate is considerable, and the chocolate industry has been happy to encourage it. A month later comes a second holiday, invented in the late 1970s by a Japanese candy company. On this day, men are expected to return the favor, and the social expectation is that the return gift should be worth 2 or 3 times the value of what was received. This pair of holidays has spread beyond Japan to several other Asian countries, creating a 2-part chocolate-giving system with no equivalent in the West. In the end, the association between chocolate and love is a triumph of culture rather than chemistry. Chocolate does not make people fall in love, but it has been given a role in the rituals of courtship and affection that is now so deeply established, so thoroughly reinforced by tradition and marketing and social expectation, that it has become nearly inseparable from the expression of romantic feeling. When someone gives a box of chocolates to the person they care about, They are participating in a thread that stretches from the Aztec goddess of desire through the French courts to a Victorian factory in Birmingham to a Tokyo office on a February morning. And of course, a chocolate given as a gift must be wrapped. The story of how chocolate has been packaged and presented is, in its own quiet way, a mirror of everything that has mattered to the cultures that consumed it. In the late 1800s, a woman in a London sitting room might have admired the tin on her side table with more than casual interest. The chocolates inside were pleasant enough, but the tin itself was the real treasure. Decorated with elaborate designs, hand-painted flowers, embossed landscapes, or portraits of beautiful women, the chocolate tin was an object of genuine artistic quality, collected and displayed long after the last chocolate had been eaten. Some tins showed scenes from fairy tales. Others carried small reproductions of famous paintings. The finest were miniature works of art designed by professional artists and produced with a level of care that turned a simple container into something you might place on a mantelpiece. This golden age of chocolate packaging as art reached its height between roughly 1880 and 1920, when European chocolate makers competed not only on the quality of what was inside, but on the beauty of what was outside. The French excelled at boxes adorned with silk ribbons and printed illustrations. The Swiss produced elegant wrappers with alpine views and grazing cattle. The Germans preferred sturdy tins with detailed embossing. In Britain, the great chocolate families all invested in packaging that doubled as a collectible item. The chocolate box was not just a way to hold chocolates. It was a canvas, a reflection of the artistic tastes of the time rendered in miniature. The story of how chocolate has been branded tells us something about the growing art of making people want things. One of the most successful branding decisions in the history of food was a single color choice. In 1905, one of the great British chocolate firms began wrapping its products in a deep, rich shade of purple. The choice may have been made to honor a recently deceased queen whose royal associations lent the color an air of elegance. Over the following century, that particular shade of purple became so closely identified with the company that it attempted to claim legal ownership of the color itself, a dispute that wound through the courts for more than a decade. Whether or not the courts agreed, the cultural fact was already established. In Britain, that shade of purple could mean only one thing. At the opposite end of the spectrum was the American approach to chocolate branding, built not on visual elegance, but on stubbornly refusing to advertise at all. For nearly 70 years from the founding of his company until the year 1970, Milton Hershey spent almost nothing on advertising. He believed that if the product was good enough and the price was right, the chocolate would sell itself. His familiar brown and silver wrapper became an American icon, not through billboards and magazine spreads, but through sheer presence. The same bar on the same shelf in every shop and station in the country. The strategy was eventually abandoned when competitors began spending heavily on their own campaigns, but for decades it stood as a remarkable exception to every rule of modern marketing. The 20th century brought new tools for selling chocolate. Radio in the 1930s and 40s allowed companies to reach large audiences through jingles and sponsored programs. Television in the 1950s transformed the art of chocolate advertising, making it possible to show chocolate being poured, broken, bitten into, and melting on the tongue. One company's animated characters for its candy-coated chocolate pellets became some of the most recognized brand figures in advertising history. One of the most celebrated chocolate advertisements ever made broke every traditional rule of the craft. In 2007, a British campaign showed a figure in a gorilla costume sitting behind a drum kit, eyes closed, lost in the music, as a famous pop song built slowly to its explosive drum break. The gorilla played along with increasing joy. The chocolate appeared only at the very end in a brief flash. There were no product claims, no demonstrations, no testimonials, nothing that a textbook on advertising would have considered necessary. And yet, it became one of the most acclaimed advertisements ever produced, a reminder that the most powerful way to sell something is sometimes to make people feel something. The history of chocolate packaging also tracks the way societies have changed what they value. In the early 20th century, chocolate was sold on the promise of purity and quality, appealing to a public worried about what was actually in their food. By the middle of the century, the emphasis had shifted to pleasure, indulgence, and the idea of chocolate as a small daily luxury, a reward for getting through an ordinary day. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the emphasis moved again toward ethical sourcing, health benefits, and the story behind the bar. Modern craft chocolate wrappers tend toward clean, minimalist designs with prominent information about where the cacao was grown, what percentage of it is in the bar, and which certification programs the maker belongs to. Chocolate packaging has also served as a carrier of larger cultural messages. During the Second World War, chocolate wrappers carried patriotic slogans and images. In the decades of social change that followed, chocolate advertising reflected the spirit of the times, using images of freedom and self-expression that would have shocked the Victorian confectioners who had decorated their tins with pastoral scenes and classical portraits. In the end, the story of the chocolate box, from the hand-painted tin of a Victorian shop to the minimalist wrapper of a modern craft bar, traces a broader arc. Chocolate packaging has always been more than a way to hold its contents. It has been a mirror reflecting the values, the worries, and the aspirations of the people who made it and the people who bought it. In every era, the way chocolate was wrapped and presented told us as much about ourselves as about the chocolate inside. And now, let us cross the border into two countries, Belgium and France, where the art of making chocolate by hand reached heights that the rest of the world has been trying to match ever since. In 1857, a Swiss pharmacist opened a small shop in one of the elegant covered shopping arcades in the heart of Brussels. His name was Jean Neuhaus, and he sold medicines. Like many pharmacists of his day, he coated his more bitter pills in a thin layer of chocolate to make them easier to swallow. His shop sat among the polished marble and gas lamps of the arcade, and in that refined setting, the chocolate-coated remedies gradually became more popular than the medicines themselves. People started coming not for what he could cure, but for what he could make. More than half a century later, in 1912, his grandson, who carried the same name, was working in the family shop when he created something that would define Belgian chocolate forever. The younger Neuhaus took a small chocolate shell and, instead of filling it with medicine, filled it with a soft flavored cream. He called this creation a praline, borrowing a word that had previously meant something quite different, a sugar-coated almond. But this was something new, a bite-sized chocolate with a thin, crisp outer shell and a soft, yielding interior that could be filled with any number of things: cream, caramel, nut paste, marzipan, or delicate flavored mixtures. It was a tiny world of contrasting textures and balanced flavors, a creation that lifted chocolate from a simple pleasure into something closer to art. The new invention needed the right packaging. The traditional paper cone used to sell sweets in Brussels was no good for such delicate creations, which were easily crushed. The solution came from an unexpected source. The chocolatier's wife, a former ballet dancer, designed a special folding cardboard box that cradled each praline in its own small space, protecting them during transport and presenting them as objects of beauty. The box was designed to be given as a gift, and the elegant way it opened and displayed its contents became part of the experience itself. When other Belgian chocolate makers asked to use the design, the family generously agreed. The box was never protected by a legal claim, and it became a shared symbol of Belgian chocolate culture, adopted by virtually every maker in the country. The tradition that this invention started grew into one of the great food cultures of Europe. Brussels and the rest of Belgium became a destination for chocolate lovers, with hundreds of small makers practicing their craft in shops that ranged from modest storefronts to opulent boutiques. Belgian chocolate makers developed their own specialties: fresh cream fillings, dusted cocoa truffles, hazelnut paste blends inspired by Italian traditions. Each maker developed signature flavors and techniques, and the culture of the country fostered a competitive perfectionism that pushed standards ever higher. The chocolate tradition in neighboring France followed a different but equally distinguished path. Where Belgium excelled at filled chocolates and individual pieces, France elevated chocolate to the level of fine cooking. French chocolate makers approached their work with the same reverence for technique, ingredient quality, and presentation that characterized French cuisine more broadly. The French gave the world the ganache, a smooth, rich blend of chocolate and cream that became the heart of truffles and filled chocolates. They created the chocolate eclair and the elaborate chocolate sculptures that French pastry chefs built for celebrations and special occasions. But perhaps the most important French contribution to the modern chocolate world was an idea borrowed from wine. The French word for it has no exact English equivalent. It refers to the complete natural environment in which a food is produced, the soil, the climate, the altitude, the rainfall, and the traditions of the people who grow it. This concept had long been at the center of French wine culture, where it is taken for granted that a grape grown in one valley will taste different from the same grape grown in another. French chocolate makers, most notably a company in the wine country south of Lyon, applied this same idea to cacao. That company, founded in the 1920s by a pastry chef in the town of a famous wine-growing region, began creating chocolates made from cacao sourced from specific places, individual countries, estates, or even single harvests. The idea was that chocolate, like wine, could express the unique character of the land where its raw material was grown. They created a vocabulary for this, borrowing directly from the wine world, and established a professional school that trained chefs and chocolate makers from around the globe. Through this school and through its network of professional clients, the idea spread worldwide. The notion that cacao from one country tastes different from cacao grown in another, and that these differences are worth paying attention to, was not entirely new, but this was the first company to build a brand around it, creating a market for place-specific chocolate that hundreds of smaller makers would eventually follow. The Belgian and French traditions, while different in emphasis, shared a basic commitment, the belief that chocolate is a craft rather than a commodity. Both valued small-scale production, hand skill, and the importance of flavor over cost. Both resisted, to varying degrees, the industrialization and standardization that defined the mass-market chocolate made by the great global corporations. And both produced makers whose work moved beyond the merely commercial and into the territory of genuine artistry. In more recent decades, individual chocolatiers have pushed the boundaries even further. One maker in Brussels became one of the first Europeans to source and roast his own cacao beans, bridging the gap between the traditional praline maker and the emerging movement of small-batch chocolate production. In France, another became famous for towering chocolate sculptures as much as for his confections, treating chocolate as a medium for artistic expression on a monumental scale. The influence of these traditions extends far beyond the borders of Belgium and France. The praline, the ganache, the truffle, the concept of place-specific chocolate, the vocabulary of fine cacao, all of these have become part of the global language of quality chocolate. When a maker in California labels a bar with the name of a single growing region, or when a Japanese chocolatier fills a praline with a delicate citrus cream, they are working within a framework that Belgium and France built and refined over more than a century. And now, let us travel east, to a country that took the idea of chocolate and reinvented it in ways that no one in Europe could have predicted. In the spring of the year 2000, a chocolate company in Japan released a new flavor of a familiar wafer bar that would have puzzled the English confectioners who created the original more than 60 years earlier. The flavor was green tea, the finely ground powder that had been at the heart of Japanese tea ceremony for centuries. The bar was pale jade in color, with a delicate, slightly bitter vegetal sweetness. It was an improbable marriage of English candy-making tradition and Japanese tea culture, and it was an instant success. Over the following 2 decades, the company would release more than 300 additional flavors, including strawberry cheesecake, rice wine, sweet potato, red bean, melon, and dozens of specialties available only in specific regions of the country. The bar became the most popular souvenir in Japan, a little candy that somehow captured the Japanese gift for taking something foreign and remaking it through the lens of local culture until it became something entirely new. Japan's relationship with chocolate began much earlier, though it took a very long time to blossom. The first recorded arrival of chocolate in Japan came in the late 1700s, when Dutch traders, the only Europeans permitted to do business with Japan during its long period of isolation, brought it to a small island trading post in the harbor of a southern city. But chocolate remained a curiosity, known only to the handful of translators and officials who dealt with the Dutch, until Japan opened itself to the wider world in the 1860s. During the decades that followed, chocolate was introduced as a Western luxury, sold in small amounts at high prices in the port cities. The first Japanese chocolate factories were established around the turn of the 20th century. At first, they simply imitated Western products. But by the middle of the century, Japanese makers had begun to develop their own approach, one that prized subtlety, refinement, and a willingness to experiment with flavors that had no precedent in the European or American tradition. The wafer bar's remarkable success in Japan is one of the most studied examples of how a food product can be adapted across cultures. Part of the appeal was a lucky accident of language. The bar's name, when pronounced in Japanese, sounds very much like a phrase meaning "you will surely win." This made the candy a natural good luck gift, especially for students facing important exams. Giving one of these bars to a student before a test became a widespread custom, and the company was shrewd enough to encourage it, releasing special packaging and flavors for exam season. But the real reason for the phenomenon went deeper than a happy coincidence of sounds. The hundreds of flavors reflected a broader Japanese sensibility, the elevation of the ordinary through craftsmanship and attention to the seasons. Cherry blossom flavors appeared in spring. Sweet potato and chestnut arrived in autumn. Regional additions celebrated local foods and traditions, turning a simple candy bar into a map of Japan's food culture. Japan's most distinctive contribution to the global chocolate world was the creation of a unique system of gift-giving around a certain February holiday. When the holiday was introduced in the 1930s through the efforts of a candy company, it evolved into something quite different from its Western version. In Japan, it became an occasion for women to give chocolate to men, reversing the pattern seen in Europe and North America. The tradition developed carefully defined categories. There was chocolate given to someone you truly cared about, often handmade to show sincerity and effort. There was obligation chocolate given to male colleagues and acquaintances as a social courtesy. And there was friend chocolate, exchanged among women as a gesture of warmth. Each type carried a specific social meaning, and the quality and presentation of the gift communicated a precise message about the nature of the relationship. 1 month later came a second holiday, invented in the late 1970s by a Japanese candy company. On this day, men were expected to return the favor. The social expectation was that the return gift should be worth 2 or 3 times the original. This pair of holidays spread to several other countries in East Asia, creating a 2-part chocolate exchange system found nowhere else in the world. Beyond these cultural innovations, Japan developed a thriving chocolate culture that embraced both large-scale production and small batch craft. Japanese department stores devoted entire floors to chocolate during the gift-giving season, featuring the work of European masters alongside emerging Japanese makers. Some of these Japanese makers began winning international prizes, recognized for the extraordinary care and precision they brought to every stage of the process, from sourcing the beans to shaping the finished bar. Japan's chocolate story shows us something important about how cultures absorb and transform things from the outside world. Chocolate arrived in Japan as a foreign novelty with no connection to local tradition. But within the span of a century, Japanese culture took it in, reshaped it, and made it something distinctly its own. The green tea wafer bar, the gift-giving rituals, the regional flavor explorations, and the growing craft movement all represent not simple copying, but creative reinvention. A process that turned a foreign import into something that now feels as Japanese as the tea ceremony itself. And now, let us turn our attention back across the Pacific to the lands where cacao first grew, where a quiet revolution has been bringing chocolate home. On the northern coast of Venezuela, tucked inside a valley within one of the oldest national parks in Latin America, a small cacao plantation has been producing some of the finest beans on earth for roughly 400 years. The estate covers only about 140 hectares and its yearly harvest amounts to barely 20 tons. By the standards of a global industry that produces over 5 million tons a year, this place is barely a rounding error. But among chocolate makers and cacao lovers, it is legendary. The source of a delicate cacao variety so refined and complex that it is to chocolate what the finest wine is to grapes. The way the beans are fermented in wooden boxes and dried on warm stone patios has remained essentially unchanged since the 1600s. Everything is done by hand. Everything is unhurried. The whole process stands in quiet defiance of the industrial speed that defines most of the modern chocolate world. For most of the modern era, Latin America occupied a painful position in the story of chocolate. The continent where cacao was born, where it was first cultivated, where it was treated as sacred, had been reduced to a supplier of raw materials. The countries that grew the cacao did not, for the most part, make the chocolate. The beans were shipped to Europe and North America, where they were turned into finished products and sold at vastly higher prices. The profits, the prestige, and the pleasure all flowed in one direction, away from the places where cacao had its deepest roots. This pattern was a direct legacy of colonialism. Spain had established it in the 1500s, extracting cacao from its American territories and processing it in European monasteries and workshops. The British, Dutch, and French colonial powers continued the pattern, building cacao export economies while keeping the manufacturing stages firmly at home. When West Africa became the dominant growing region in the 20th century, Latin America's share of global production fell, but for the cacao that was still grown there, the same one-sided arrangement persisted. The reversal began slowly and from several directions at once. In Ecuador, which produces more cacao than any other Latin American country, a particular type of fine cacao native to the country became the centerpiece of a national chocolate rebirth. This cacao variety is generally considered one of the most sought after in the world. Its beans produce chocolate with distinctive floral and fruity qualities, a complexity that reflects the variety's deep connection to the Ecuadorian landscape. In the early 2000s, Ecuadorian entrepreneurs began doing something that had rarely been done before. They started making finished chocolate within the country, using local beans and local labor to produce bars that competed directly with the finest European products. One company in particular became a symbol of what was possible. Founded on the principle of making chocolate from tree to bar within Ecuador, it sourced directly from indigenous and smallholder farming communities, paid farmers well above the going commodity rate, and produced the final product entirely in-country. It went on to win hundreds of medals at international competitions, proving beyond any doubt that Latin American chocolate could match and surpass the European standard. In Venezuela, despite years of deep economic and political crisis, the tradition of fine cacao survived. The delicate varieties grown in the country's legendary valleys continued to be prized by the world's best chocolate makers. Venezuelan cacao, which once dominated the global market, now accounts for only a tiny fraction of world production, but its reputation for quality remains unmatched. In Mexico, the country most closely tied to the origins of chocolate drinking, the reclaiming of cacao culture carried a particular emotional weight. Artisan chocolate makers drew directly on the traditions of their Mesoamerican ancestors, producing tablets of ground cacao flavored with chili, cinnamon, and unrefined cane sugar. In the southern state of Oaxaca, the tradition of grinding cacao by hand on a flat stone, the same kind of stone used since the time of the Olmec, survived in small workshops and open-air markets. These were living connections to a chocolate tradition that stretched back thousands of years before any Europeans set foot in the Americas. Colombia, too, experienced a remarkable cacao revival. The country's varied geography, from mountain highlands to coastal lowlands to Amazonian rainforest, produces cacao with a wide range of flavor profiles. The government and international organizations promoted cacao farming as an alternative to the cultivation of other, less desirable crops, making cacao a tool of agricultural transition and, in a sense, a crop of peace. Colombian chocolate makers began producing bars that showcased the country's extraordinary range of flavors. Peru, where some of the oldest evidence of cacao use anywhere in the world has been found, also joined the revival. Cacao from several Peruvian regions gained recognition for its complexity, and Peruvian chocolate makers began winning their share of international prizes. The return of finished chocolate production to Latin America is more than an economic shift. It is an act of cultural reclamation. For 5,000 years, the people of the Americas cultivated, processed, and enjoyed cacao on their own terms. For 5 centuries after the conquest, they were stripped of the value their crop created, reduced to suppliers of raw material for a distant industry. The new generation of Latin American chocolate makers, working with their own beans in their own countries, represents a partial reversal of that long dispossession, a quiet insistence that the people who grow cacao should also share in the pleasure and the profit of the chocolate it becomes. And this movement in Latin America was part of a broader wave that was changing the chocolate world from the inside out, a wave that would come to be known as the Third Age of Chocolate. In 1996, in a small workshop in Berkeley, California, a sparkling winemaker and a physician decided to do something that no one in America had attempted in over 50 years. They decided to make chocolate from scratch. The winemaker believed that the same principles that produced great wine, attention to where the raw material came from, careful control of every step, respect for the unique character of each harvest, could also produce great chocolate. The physician, who had been diagnosed with a serious illness and was determined to pursue his passions while he still could, was a devoted chocolate lover who had studied the craft in France. Together, they founded a company that became the first in America in half a century to produce chocolate from the raw bean all the way to the finished bar. The phrase they helped popularize, bean to bar, described a way of making chocolate that was, in the context of the modern industry, quietly revolutionary. For most of the 20th century, the vast majority of chocolate companies did not actually make chocolate. They bought it already processed from huge industrial firms, then melted it, flavored it, shaped it, and wrapped it. The actual work of turning a raw cacao bean into chocolate, the roasting, the cracking, the grinding, the refining, the long, slow mixing, had been handed over to a handful of giant processors who supplied the entire world. The founders of this small California company took all of that back. They sourced beans directly from farms and cooperatives in the tropics and controlled every step of the process themselves. The company borrowed deliberately from the language and culture of wine. It was among the first American chocolate makers to print the percentage of cacao on each bar, a practice that would become standard in the craft chocolate world. Its bars were presented with the same attention to origin and flavor that characterized fine wine. The message was that chocolate, like wine, could express the unique character of the place where its raw material was grown. The company's success attracted attention and, eventually, a buyer. In 2005, a large American chocolate corporation purchased it. The original factory was closed and production was moved elsewhere. For many in the growing community of small-batch chocolate enthusiasts, the acquisition was a cautionary tale, but it also planted a seed. 2 young men who had recently sold their technology company were inspired by the closure to start their own chocolate operation in San Francisco. Their approach was radically simple, just 2 ingredients, cacao beans and sugar, sourced from individual growing regions and produced in a factory that doubled as a shop where people could watch the chocolate being made. Their bars became some of the most celebrated in the craft chocolate world. The movement drew openly on the specialty coffee revolution that had come before it. Just as a generation of small coffee roasters had taught people to care about where their coffee came from and how it was processed, the new chocolate makers set out to show consumers the enormous diversity of flavors hiding inside cacao, flavors that industrial processing had wiped smooth and uniform. A bar made from beans grown in one African island nation might burst with bright berry notes. A bar from a Central American country might taste of brown sugar and warm spice. A bar from a Pacific island could carry smoky, earthy qualities. The same raw material, handled with the same basic technique, could produce wildly different results depending on where the cacao grew, what variety it was, and how it had been fermented and dried. One of the most inventive of the early makers took a different approach entirely. Founded by a former space agency technologist and later led by the founder of a famous technology magazine, this company labeled its bars not by where the beans came from, but by what the chocolate tasted like, using simple words like fruity, nutty, and chocolatey. More importantly, it set up flavor workshops in cacao-producing countries, teaching farmers to make and taste their own chocolate so they could understand how their work in the field affected the flavor of the finished product. This feedback loop connecting the farmer to the final taste was a radical departure from the traditional system, in which beans disappeared into an anonymous supply chain and the person who grew them never knew what the result tasted like. The movement was not without its difficulties. In 2015, an investigation revealed that one of the most prominent and commercially successful craft makers had, in its early years, used commercially produced chocolate from a European company while marketing its products as made from scratch. The controversy damaged the company's reputation and raised sharp questions about honesty, transparency, and the high prices, often around $10 for a single bar, that craft makers charged. Despite that controversy, the movement continued to grow. By the 2020s, hundreds of small-batch chocolate makers were operating in the United States alone, and thousands more had sprung up across Europe, Asia, Latin America, and Australia. The movement had its own awards, its own festivals, its own publications, and its own culture of passionate, sometimes obsessive, appreciation. Craft chocolate had achieved what specialty coffee had achieved a generation earlier: the creation of a separate world in which quality, origin, and honesty commanded both premium prices and deep loyalty. The revolution also changed the relationship between chocolate makers and the people who grow cacao. The traditional commodity system treated cacao as a bulk product, priced by weight with no concern for quality or origin. Craft makers, by contrast, sought out specific beans from specific farms, and they were willing to pay well above the going rate for cacao that met their standards. This model, while not without its own complications, gave farmers a reason to invest in quality rather than quantity, to experiment with how they fermented and dried their beans, and to preserve old and rare cacao varieties that the commodity market had no interest in. The third wave of chocolate, like the third wave of coffee, represents a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between the people who grow, the people who make, and the people who eat. It has not replaced the industrial chocolate that still makes up the vast majority of what the world consumes, but it has shown that another way is possible. And yet, even as this hopeful movement grows, the very future of cacao faces a threat that no amount of craft or care can solve on its own. In the growing season of 2023, the cacao farms of West Africa experienced something that sent a tremor through the entire global chocolate supply chain. Rainfall far beyond anything in living memory created perfect conditions for two of the most destructive diseases of the cacao tree. One was a type of rot that attacks the pods. The other was a virus, spread by tiny insects, that causes the branches and roots of the tree to swell until the tree eventually dies. One of the two main producing countries reported that more than 80% of its cocoa crop had been affected by the virus. Yields collapsed. Farmers who had spent years nurturing their trees watched helplessly as their livelihoods withered. This was not an isolated event. It was a preview of a future that scientists have been warning about for more than a decade. Cacao is one of the most climate-sensitive crops on Earth. The tree evolved in the stable, humid environment of the tropical rainforest, and it needs conditions that fall within a remarkably narrow range. It requires steady rainfall of at least 1,250 millimeters per year, spread fairly evenly throughout the seasons. It needs high humidity, ideally above 80%. It demands temperatures that stay between roughly 21 and 32 degrees. It cannot survive drought. It cannot survive frost. It cannot survive the kind of extreme weather events that a warming world is making more frequent and more severe across the tropics. The projections are sobering. Scientists who have modeled the impact of a changing climate on the cacao-growing regions of the world have concluded that West Africa could lose up to half of its suitable growing area by the middle of this century. This does not necessarily mean production will be cut in half, because some of the losses may be partly offset by shifting farming to higher ground or by developing hardier varieties. But the scale of the potential disruption is enormous, especially for a region that produces roughly 2/3 of the world's cacao. Researchers have found that the main growing regions of the two leading producer countries already experience about 40 additional days per year of extreme heat compared to past decades. These extra hot days reduce cacao production directly through heat stress and indirectly by drying out the soil faster than rainfall can replenish it. The northern edges of the main growing zones, where temperatures are already near the upper limit of what the trees can handle, face the worst projected losses. The disease picture is equally troubling. Cacao has always been vulnerable to illness, but the changing climate is altering where diseases can take hold and how severe they become. Two of the most destructive cacao diseases in the Americas have so far been absent from Africa and Asia. But scientists warn that shifting weather patterns could carry these diseases to new continents, with potentially devastating consequences for the global supply. Adding to the problem is the environmental damage caused by cacao farming itself. The expansion of cacao plantations has been a major driver of tropical deforestation, especially in West Africa. One of the two main producing countries has lost nearly 90% of its rainforests since gaining independence in the early 1960s, and cacao cultivation is a primary cause. Even national parks and protected forests have been invaded by farmers desperate for land. The cruel irony is that the forests being cut down are the very forests that regulate the local climate, maintaining the humidity, temperature, and rainfall patterns that cacao needs to survive. When the trees around a cacao farm are removed, the local conditions get hotter, drier, and less predictable. The crop that destroyed the forest ends up destroying itself. There is a better way. Growing cacao under a canopy of taller shade trees in a system that mimics the natural forest environment produces lower yields per plot, but creates farms that are far more resilient to weather changes and far better for the surrounding environment. These mixed farming systems store carbon, protect rivers and streams, and preserve some of the natural diversity that pure cacao plantations destroy. The problem is economic. Farmers who are already earning below the poverty line cannot easily afford to give up short-term production for long-term resilience. Without financial support and incentives, the shift to more sustainable farming happens agonizingly slowly. The race to develop climate-resistant cacao varieties is one of the most urgent projects in tropical farming today. Scientists at research centers around the world are using both traditional breeding methods and newer genetic tools to create trees that can withstand higher temperatures, fight off diseases, and maintain production under changing conditions. Gene editing technology has been applied to cacao, with researchers successfully changing a specific gene that suppresses the tree's natural defenses, potentially making it more resistant to illness. One of the world's largest chocolate companies has partnered with a biotechnology firm to develop edited cacao varieties designed for resilience. But even if these efforts succeed, they will take time. A new variety must be tested in the field for years before it can be shared with farmers, and the trees themselves need 3 to 5 years to begin producing pods. The pace of scientific improvement is measured in decades. The pace of climate change is accelerating. The gap between these two timelines is one of the greatest risks to the future of chocolate. The chocolate crisis is, in the end, a crisis of the global food system. A crop that feeds an industry worth well over $100 billion is grown by some of the poorest people on the planet. In some of the most fragile environments, under conditions being destabilized by the emissions of the wealthy nations that consume the finished product. Whether the world can find the will and the resources to address this before it becomes irreversible is a question that remains, as of now, painfully open. And alongside this question of survival sits another, equally urgent, about whether the people who grow cacao will ever receive a fair share of the wealth their labor creates. In early 2024, the price of cocoa on the world's commodity exchanges did something it had never done before. It surged to more than 4 times its historical average, driven by the devastating growing season that had seen disease and extreme weather destroy much of the West African harvest. Chocolate companies announced price increases. News outlets ran stories about a coming chocolate shortage. And in the middle of the panic, a question emerged that cut to the heart of the global chocolate economy. If the market price of cocoa had nearly quadrupled, were the farmers who grew it 4 times better off? The answer was no. Despite record prices on the trading floors of London and New York, farmers in the 2 main producing countries received only a fraction of the market rate, with the rest absorbed by middlemen, exporters, and the government agencies that control cocoa sales. Even at record prices, most cacao farmers remained below what is called the living income threshold, the minimum a family needs for food, shelter, healthcare, and education. This gap between the world market price and what the farmer actually receives is not a temporary glitch. It is a built-in feature of the way the global cocoa trade works. A chocolate bar that sells for a couple of euros in a European supermarket divides its value with striking inequality. The farmer who grew the cocoa receives roughly 7 cents out of every euro spent. The remaining 93 cents is split among traders, processors, manufacturers, retailers, and governments. The chocolate companies, which handle the processing, the branding, and the marketing, capture the largest share. The farmers, who bear the risk of weather, disease, and unpredictable prices, receive the smallest. The fair trade movement arose in the late 20th century as an attempt to address this imbalance. The idea was straightforward. Create a separate market in which consumers pay a small premium for products certified to have been produced under fair conditions, with that premium passed back to farmers in the form of a guaranteed minimum price and extra funds for community projects. The first certified chocolate products appeared in the late 1980s, and by the 1990s, the certification label had become a familiar sight in supermarkets across Europe and North America. Whether fair trade certification has truly made a difference in the cocoa sector is a subject of ongoing debate. Those who support it argue that it has provided a meaningful safety net for participating farmers, funded schools and water systems, and raised public awareness about the conditions in which chocolate is produced. Critics respond that the premium is too small to lift anyone out of poverty, that the costs of certification can eat into a small farmer's income, and that the label often benefits the retailers and brands that display it more than the farmers it claims to help. Other certification programs take a different approach. One of the largest focuses on environmental sustainability and farming practices rather than setting a minimum price. It requires farms to meet standards covering environmental protection, workers' rights, and farm management. This seal has become the most widely used sustainability label in the cocoa world, appearing on products from many of the largest chocolate companies. Beyond certification, a growing number of chocolate makers have adopted a model of buying directly from farmers or cooperatives, bypassing the commodity exchanges entirely. This approach, inspired by the specialty coffee movement, allows makers to pay well above the market rate, often 2 or 3 times as much, in exchange for high-quality beans that meet specific standards. The direct relationship creates a bond between the person who makes the chocolate and the person who grows the beans, cutting out the many layers of middlemen that consume value in the conventional system. Direct trade has been genuinely transformative for the relatively small number of farmers involved, but it remains a tiny corner of the global cocoa trade. The vast majority of the world's 5 or 6 million cacao farmers continue to sell their beans into the traditional commodity system, where prices are set by traders in distant cities that most farmers will never visit. The ethical tangle of the chocolate supply chain is made even more complicated by the problem of tracing where cacao comes from. Most commercial chocolate is made from blended beans gathered from thousands of individual farms across multiple countries. At each stage of the journey, beans from different farms and regions are mixed together, making it nearly impossible to trace a finished bar back to the specific farm where its cacao was grown. Without that ability to trace, claims about ethical sourcing are difficult to verify, and abuses within the system can be hidden behind layer after layer of middlemen. The price crisis of 2024 laid bare the fragility of the whole arrangement. When supply shocks sent prices soaring, the burden fell on consumers, who paid more for their chocolate, and on farmers, whose higher per-unit earnings were offset by dramatically smaller harvests. The companies in the middle adapted by adjusting their buying strategies, reducing the amount of chocolate in their products and passing costs along. The underlying inequality was, if anything, made worse by the crisis rather than corrected by it. The most honest assessment of the situation is uncomfortable. The history of the chocolate supply chain, from the enslaved workers of colonial plantations to the impoverished farmers of the 21st century, suggests that the sweetness of chocolate has always been underwritten by the hardship of those who produce it. Whether this generation of consumers, companies, and governments will be the one to change that pattern is perhaps the most important open question in the entire moral history of chocolate. And now, let us lighten the mood a little and explore a question that has followed chocolate for centuries, a question that is still being answered today. Is chocolate something that heals us, or something that harms us? In the early 1600s, a patient at a hospital in one of Europe's great cities would have found something unexpected in the pharmacy. Alongside the dried herbs, mineral powders, and other remedies of the age, there would have been chocolate. Not as a treat for recovering patients, but as a medicine in its own right, prepared by the hospital pharmacist and prescribed for a startling range of complaints. Records from the period show chocolate regularly stocked alongside other drugs. Physicians mixed it with cinnamon, saffron, nutmeg, pepper, and vanilla, depending on what they were trying to treat. It was prescribed for poor appetite, stomach trouble, tiredness, fever, and in a detail that says something about the priorities of the era, for a flagging desire for romance. When chocolate first arrived in Europe from the Americas, it was understood primarily as a drug rather than a food. This made sense within the medical thinking of the time, which classified all substances by their qualities of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Cacao was considered cold by nature, which made it theoretically useful against conditions thought to be caused by too much heat. But because chocolate could be prepared in so many ways, with different spices added or removed, it was considered remarkably flexible, a substance that could be adjusted to treat almost any imbalance. Over the course of the 1600s and 1700s, European doctors claimed more than 100 different medical uses for chocolate. The doctors who promoted chocolate as a cure for everything were not always acting out of pure scientific curiosity. The chocolate trade was extremely profitable, and physicians who recommended chocolate to their patients were helping to sustain a business in which they sometimes had a personal interest. But the belief in chocolate's healing powers was genuine and widespread, shared not just by everyday people, but by some of the most respected medical minds of the age. The medicinal reputation of chocolate faded during the 1800s as modern scientific medicine replaced the old systems. Chocolate was reclassified from a drug to a sweet, and its health claims were dismissed as outdated nonsense. For roughly a century, from the middle of the 1800s to the late 1900s, the medical world regarded chocolate as nutritionally unremarkable at best and harmful at worst, a source of extra calories, sugar, and fat that contributed to weight gain, tooth decay, and skin problems. The rehabilitation of chocolate as something potentially good for you began in the 1990s, when studies started to suggest that people who ate more chocolate and similar foods had lower rates of heart disease. The compound at the center of this research was a family of natural substances found in cacao beans. These substances appeared to improve the health of blood vessels, lower blood pressure, reduce the tendency of blood to clot, and improve the body's response to sugar. The most thorough evidence came from a large clinical trial published in 2022. The study enrolled over 21,000 participants and randomly assigned them to take either a daily cacao supplement or a lookalike pill with no active ingredient. After more than 3 years of follow-up, the results were carefully mixed. The supplement did not significantly reduce the overall rate of heart-related events, which was the main thing the researchers were looking for. But it did reduce the rate of death from heart disease by 27%, and it reduced a combined measure of serious heart problems by 16%. These were meaningful findings that pointed to real benefits. The catch, and there was always going to be a catch, was that the benefits came from a concentrated supplement, not from eating chocolate. Most finished chocolate is a poor source of the beneficial compounds, because the processing steps that turn raw cacao into a smooth, pleasant product, the roasting, the treatment with mild substances to reduce bitterness, and the long mixing, destroy much of what was originally there. Chocolate treated with the Dutch method retains only a small fraction of the helpful compounds found in untreated cacao, and most chocolate products do not list how much of these compounds they contain, so there is no way for a consumer to know. Furthermore, the potential benefits have to be weighed against the downsides of what else comes in a typical chocolate bar. An average milk chocolate bar is roughly half sugar, a third fat, and only 10 to 20% cocoa. Even dark chocolate, which is promoted as the healthier choice, still contains a great deal of sugar. The calories, sugar, and fat in most commercial chocolate contribute to the very health problems that the beneficial compounds in cacao are thought to help prevent. It is a genuine paradox. The good and the bad come packaged together, and getting enough of the good through regular chocolate eating would mean consuming far more of the bad than any doctor would recommend. The stimulant naturally present in cacao, a compound related to but milder than caffeine, has its own complicated story. It gently widens blood vessels, acts as a mild fluid remover, and may help quiet a cough. Unlike caffeine, it does not strongly stimulate the brain, which is why chocolate provides a gentler, longer-lasting lift than a cup of coffee. But this same compound is the reason chocolate is poisonous to dogs and cats, whose bodies process it far more slowly than ours do. A small amount of dark chocolate can be lethal to a small dog, a sobering reminder that the same substance can be harmless or dangerous depending on who consumes it. The health story of chocolate is, in the end, a story of complexity that resists the simple answers that both its advocates and its critics would prefer. Chocolate is neither the miracle medicine that 17th century physicians believed, nor the nutritional villain that 20th century doctors feared. It contains genuine compounds with measurable benefits, and it also contains sugar and fat in amounts that can cause real harm. The truth sits in the uncomfortable middle ground where most nutritional truths live. In moderation, as part of a balanced life, chocolate can be a perfectly reasonable pleasure. In excess, it contributes to the very problems its best compounds might help prevent. The food of the gods, it turns out, is as complicated in its effects on the body as it is rich in its history. And speaking of the many ways people have embraced chocolate, let us take one last tour around the world to see how different cultures have made this single ingredient their own. In the city of Turin, in the hills of northwestern Italy, a chocolate tradition was born out of crisis. During the wars of the early 1800s, a trade blockade cut off the supply of cacao to much of Europe. The chocolatiers of the region, facing a shortage of their main ingredient, came up with a clever solution. They stretched their dwindling cacao supply by blending it with hazelnuts, which grew in great abundance in the surrounding countryside. The result was a smooth, creamy paste of chocolate and roughly 30% hazelnut, more affordable than pure chocolate and, as it turned out, delicious in its own right. The confection took the name of a cheerful character from local theatre, a figure who embodied the practical, pleasure-loving spirit of the region. In 1852, a company in Turin took the mixture a step further, shaping it into small, wedge-shaped pieces and wrapping each one in gold foil. These tiny chocolates became an icon of the city. More than a century later, the same basic idea of mixing chocolate with hazelnuts would achieve global fame in a rather different form. In 1964, a company in a nearby town launched a spreadable version that became one of the most popular food products on Earth. Its origins in the wartime chocolate hazelnut tradition are rarely remembered today, but every jar carries the memory of a solution born from scarcity. In Mexico, the tradition of chocolate never disappeared. It simply changed shape. While European colonists carried cacao across the ocean and remade it in their image, the people of Mexico continued to prepare chocolate in ways that connected them to their ancient past. One of the oldest surviving chocolate preparations in the Americas is a thick, warm drink made from a corn-based dough, chocolate, unrefined cane sugar, water or milk, and often flavored with cinnamon. Its roots go back to the ancient practice of mixing cacao with ground corn, a combination that predates the arrival of Europeans by centuries. This drink is traditionally served in the morning or late afternoon, a gentle, warming thing that sustains the body and connects the person drinking it to a line of tradition stretching back to the Olmec and the Maya. In the markets of the southern state of Oaxaca, the tradition of grinding cacao by hand on a flat stone surface, the same kind of surface used in Mesoamerica for thousands of years, survived into the 21st century. Chocolate grinders still operate shops where customers bring their own selected ingredients, cacao, sugar, cinnamon, almonds, and watch as they are ground to order. The resulting tablets are used to make hot chocolate, rich sauces, and other traditional dishes. This is a living, breathing connection to a chocolate culture that began long before any European ever tasted the stuff. In the Philippines, chocolate tradition centers on small discs or balls of ground cacao that are dissolved in hot water to make a traditional warm drink. The word for these discs comes from the Spanish, reflecting the colonial origins of the country's cacao culture, which was introduced by missionaries and settlers centuries ago. Filipino cacao, grown mainly in the southern islands, has a distinctive character with fruity and floral notes. In recent years, Filipino chocolate makers have begun winning international prizes, bringing recognition to a cacao tradition that had long been overlooked. In Indonesia, the world's third-largest cacao producer, a craft chocolate scene has sprung up that draws on the country's extraordinary agricultural variety. Makers in different islands produce chocolate from local beans with a wide range of flavor profiles, reflecting the diversity of growing conditions across the vast archipelago. In Vietnam, two entrepreneurs founded a company that pioneered the craft chocolate movement in Southeast Asia, producing bars from cacao grown in the river deltas and highland regions of the country. India's relationship with chocolate is newer than most, but it has already developed its own character. While India was not traditionally a cacao-growing country, certain southern states now produce cacao in meaningful quantities. Indian confectioners have found ways to weave chocolate into their ancient tradition of sweets, a vast and varied world of confections that encompasses hundreds of regional specialties. Chocolate versions of traditional sweets now sit alongside the originals in sweet shops across the country, a fusion of a global ingredient with one of the world's oldest and most sophisticated candy-making traditions. In West Africa, where most of the world's cacao is grown, something rather remarkable is beginning to happen. For generations, these countries exported their raw beans to distant factories and imported the finished chocolate back at much higher prices. Most cacao farmers had never even tasted a finished chocolate bar. But a new generation of African chocolate makers is starting to change that. Companies in Ghana, Nigeria, and other producing countries are making chocolate from locally grown beans, challenging the old colonial pattern and insisting that the continent that grows the cacao should also share in the finished product. The Swiss still eat more chocolate per person than anyone else on Earth, roughly 10 kilograms per person each year. The Germans, Belgians, and Austrians follow close behind. The British consume about 8 kilograms per person, while Americans eat about 4.5. In Japan, the amount consumed per person is smaller, but the intensity of the country's engagement with chocolate, the creativity of its products, the passion of its seasonal gift-giving rituals may be unmatched anywhere. Each of these traditions represents a unique answer to the same question. What happens when a bitter tropical seed meets a new culture? The answer is always the same. The culture takes the seed, transforms it according to its own tastes and traditions, and creates something that could not have existed anywhere else. The story of chocolate around the world is not a story of sameness, but of endless variation, a quiet testament to the human gift for taking one raw material and finding in it the expression of 1,000 different ways of living. And as we approach the end of our journey, let us look at the enormous industry that chocolate has become and the tensions that lie at its heart. In the sprawling port of the commercial capital of the world's largest cacao-producing country, enormous sacks of dried cacao beans are loaded onto container ships bound for processing plants in Europe, Asia, and North America. The beans have traveled from thousands of small farms scattered across the country's interior, passing through buying stations, cooperatives, and the warehouses of trading companies before reaching the docks. Each sack holds the labor of farmers who earn, on average, less than $2 a day. By the time the beans have been turned into chocolate and sold to consumers in London, New York, or Tokyo, the value of those sacks will have multiplied many times over. The global chocolate market was valued at roughly $164 billion in 2024. Making chocolate one of the most valuable food products on Earth. But the way that value is shared is one of the most lopsided in the entire global food system. The modern chocolate industry runs through a supply chain of staggering complexity. At one end are roughly 5 to 6 million small-scale farmers, most of them in West Africa, who grow the raw cacao. The majority work plots of just a few hectares, using family labor and hand tools that have barely changed in generations. At the other end are the multinational corporations that process, manufacture, and sell the finished products, companies whose yearly earnings can dwarf the entire national economies of the countries that supply their raw material. Between the farmers and the brands that consumers recognize sit the processing companies that form the hidden backbone of the industry. One Swiss-Belgian firm processes roughly a quarter of all the cocoa beans harvested on Earth. An American agricultural giant handles another large share. A Singapore-based commodity trader is another major player. These three companies, along with a handful of smaller ones, control the critical middle step, the transformation of raw beans into the cocoa butter, cocoa powder, and chocolate base that the consumer brands need. When you eat a chocolate bar from almost any major manufacturer, the chocolate itself may well have been produced by one of these invisible processing firms. The consumer-facing companies, the names most people know, operate at the branding and retail end of the chain. They buy processed chocolate, or in some cases run their own processing operations and transform it into the bars, candies, and coatings that fill supermarket shelves around the world. The largest private chocolate company in the world, with yearly revenues exceeding $40 billion, began with a man stirring candy in a kitchen nearly a century ago. The other giants compete alongside it, each with chocolate portfolios worth billions. The economics of the industry are shaped by a fundamental tension between the way cacao is priced and the way chocolate is sold. Cacao is traded on commodity exchanges, where its price rises and falls with supply, demand, weather, currency movements, and the bets of traders. Farmers must accept whatever the market offers. The consumer brands, by contrast, set their own retail prices based on brand value, marketing, and how much people are willing to pay. The gap between these two pricing systems, the low commodity price paid to the farmer and the high retail price paid by the consumer, is where the industry's profits accumulate. And that accumulation happens overwhelmingly in the processing, manufacturing, and selling stages, not on the farm. The price crisis of 2024 illustrated this with painful clarity. When crop failures sent cocoa prices to record levels, the impact hit different parts of the chain in different ways. Farmers who still had cacao to sell received higher prices per sack, but many had lost much of their harvest to disease and weather, so their total income did not rise in proportion. The processing companies, which had locked in purchases at lower prices months earlier, faced significant losses. The consumer brands responded by shrinking package sizes, reducing the amount of chocolate in their products, and raising prices for shoppers. One major company launched a cocoa-free chocolate alternative, signaling that the industry was already preparing for a world in which cacao might be too scarce or too expensive for all its current uses. The concentration of the industry into a few very large companies raises uncomfortable questions about power. When a handful of processors handle most of the world's cacao and a handful of brands control most of what consumers buy, there is limited room for the kind of competition that might benefit either the farmer or the shopper. The structure looks like an hourglass. Millions of small farmers at one end, hundreds of millions of consumers at the other, and a narrow group of powerful companies in the middle, drawing value from both sides. The industry also faces new pressures from changing tastes. Health-conscious consumers in wealthy countries are cutting back on sugar, and chocolate, which is typically almost half sugar, is directly affected. The rise of plant-based diets has created demand for dairy-free alternatives. Ethical concerns about child labor, deforestation, and farmer poverty have made people more selective about which chocolate they buy. At the same time, growing markets in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East offer the potential for expansion. China and India, with their enormous populations and rising middle classes, represent vast untapped markets. The industry's center of gravity is shifting, with Asia expected to be the fastest growing chocolate market in the coming years. For all its size and sophistication, the modern chocolate industry rests on a foundation that is, in many ways, surprisingly fragile. Its raw material comes from a narrow tropical belt being destabilized by a changing climate. Its farming workforce is aging and impoverished, with few young people willing to take up a trade that offers poverty-level pay for exhausting work. Its environmental record, especially regarding the clearing of forests, is a growing source of concern. And the ethical challenges, from child labor to farmer poverty, resist the gradual, incremental solutions the industry has preferred. The industry that chocolate has become is, in many ways, a towering structure with an unsteady base, a business whose commercial success hides weaknesses that could, if left unaddressed, undermine the very thing on which it all depends. And that brings us, at last, to the question of what comes next for the tree that started it all, for the farmers who tend it, and for the 5,000-year-old story that we have been following together through the night. In a laboratory in Germany, a team of researchers was doing something that would have been unthinkable to every chocolate maker from the ancient Maya to Milton Hershey. They were making chocolate without cacao. Their starting point was a provocative idea. Most of what we taste as chocolate flavor is created not by the bean itself, but by what happens to it during processing, the fermentation, the roasting, the long chain of chemical reactions that builds flavor from scratch. If those same reactions could be triggered in other raw materials, sunflower seeds, oats, or similar ingredients, the result might taste remarkably like chocolate without a single cacao bean. They were not alone in this pursuit. One of the world's largest agricultural companies launched its own cocoa-free alternative. A startup backed by a major chocolate corporation was growing cocoa fat in a laboratory using living cells. The biggest chocolate processor in the world was investing in similar research. The idea of chocolate without cacao is the most radical disruption this food has faced in its 5,000-year history. The technology is still young, and no one has yet made a product that truly matches the real thing. It remains unclear whether people will accept a chocolate that has broken its ancient bond with the tree. But the pressures driving this work, rising costs, shrinking harvests, growing ethical concerns, are real and getting stronger. If cacao becomes too scarce or too expensive to sustain the industry as it exists today, the replacement does not need to be perfect. It just needs to be close enough. At the opposite end of the spectrum, the craft chocolate movement continues to grow and mature. In cities around the world, small makers are exploring the extraordinary range of flavors hidden inside cacao with a care and curiosity that would astonish the factory managers of the 20th century. The movement has built a community of consumers who want to know where their cacao comes from, who grew it, how it was processed, and who benefits from its sale. This demand for honesty and traceability is slowly beginning to influence even the largest companies. The genetic future of the cacao tree itself is being shaped by tools that would have seemed like fantasy a generation ago. Gene editing technology has been used by researchers to change a specific gene that suppresses the tree's natural defenses, making it more resistant to disease. One of the world's biggest chocolate companies has partnered with a biotechnology firm to develop edited cacao varieties built for resilience against illness, heat, and the broader effects of a warming world. But the use of these powerful tools raises difficult questions. Will editing cacao for hardiness and yield come at the cost of the complex, layered flavors that thousands of years of traditional cultivation produced? Will small farmers in West Africa and Latin America have access to these improved varieties, or will the technology be held by the same large corporations that already control the supply chain? And how will consumers feel about genetically edited chocolate in a time when many people are uneasy about technological changes in their food? There is another challenge, quieter but perhaps even more serious. The average cacao farmer in West Africa is over 50 years old, and very few young people are choosing to take up the work. The profession offers poverty-level pay, exhausting labor, and exposure to forces entirely beyond a farmer's control. If the next generation simply chooses not to grow cacao, the industry will face a labor crisis that no amount of science or technology can easily solve. The destruction of forests adds yet another layer of urgency. The spread of cacao farming has wiped out vast areas of tropical forest, with devastating consequences for the natural world and for the very climate that cacao needs. Efforts to stop this destruction have been slow, and illegal farming inside protected areas continues. New regulations requiring companies to prove their supply chains are free of deforestation represent a more forceful approach, but the challenges of enforcement remain large. The question of who benefits from the chocolate industry may, in the end, determine whether chocolate has a sustainable future at all. If the current system continues, in which millions of impoverished farmers effectively subsidize an industry worth over $160 billion through their own poverty, something will eventually break. Farmers will turn to other crops. Young people will refuse to take up the work. Communities will empty out. The supply of raw material on which everything depends will slowly dry up. And so, as we reach the end of our story, we find ourselves back where we began, with a tree in the forest and a question of what we choose to do next. 5,000 years ago, in the warm, damp air of what is now Ecuador, someone cracked open a strange pod and tasted the sweet pulp inside. We followed that seed as it traveled north, carried by traders along ancient routes, into the hands of the Olmec, who drank it from wide bowls in the humid lowlands of the Gulf Coast. We watched the Maya weave it into their creation stories, their weddings, their funerals, and their faith. We sat in the marketplace of the Aztec capital and counted out beans as currency. We stood in the court of an emperor who drank 50 golden cups a day. We crossed the ocean with the Spanish, who added sugar and cinnamon and kept their discovery a secret for nearly 100 years. We followed chocolate into the courts of France and Italy, through the doors of London's chocolate houses, where politicians and poets schemed over cups of cocoa. We paused to wonder at the tree itself, with its strange pods growing straight from the trunk and its impossibly complex chemistry. We met the Dutch chemist who split the bean in two and unlocked the modern age of chocolate. We walked through the model villages of the English Quakers, who believed that making chocolate and making the world better were not opposing ambitions. We watched a Swiss candle maker spend 8 years trying to mix chocolate with milk, and another Swiss inventor discover the secret of smoothness by accident on a long weekend. We traveled to Pennsylvania, where a man who had failed twice at business built a town that smelled of chocolate. We followed chocolate into the trenches of 2 world wars and watched it fall from the sky on tiny parachutes over a divided city. We journeyed to West Africa, where a blacksmith's handful of seeds became the foundation of an entire continent's agricultural economy. We looked at the dark side of this story, the forced labor, the child workers, the poverty that runs like a shadow beneath the sweetness. We explored the craft revolution that is changing how chocolate is made and understood. We tasted the way Japan reinvented it, the way Latin America is reclaiming it, the way Belgium and France turned it into art. We looked at the science, the health questions, the economics, and the enormous industry that chocolate has become. And now, here at the end, the story of chocolate is the story of us. Our appetites and our ingenuity. Our capacity for both wonder and cruelty. Our ability to take a bitter seed from the forest floor and turn it into one of the most beloved things on earth. The next time you unwrap a piece of chocolate, you might think of all the hands that touched it along the way. The farmer who harvested the pod, the worker who dried the beans in the sun, the maker who roasted and shaped them into the thing you hold. And behind them all, stretching back 5,000 years, the very first person who looked at a strange bitter seed and decided it was worth the trouble. Now, let your eyes grow heavy. Let the warmth of this story settle around you like a blanket. The history of chocolate is a long one, and you have heard it all. Sleep well and dream of something sweet.